40 here. So if I learned one thing about live streaming on YouTube, it was this piece of advice that helped me. I'm not sure how often I implement it, but when I do, I really notice a difference. So without this advice, whenever I'd watch back any of my thousands of hours of live streaming with the sound off and just watch my presentation, it would bore me to tears. But when I implemented the following advice, for the first time, I found it compelling to watch myself with the sound off. And what was the advice? It was to get clear about what's going on with you prior to pressing stream. And so what's going on with me right now is all sorts of introspection and even self-loathing, because in my preparation for this stream, I was thinking about something that somebody had said to me the other day, and I was in the middle of this 3-hour do-gooder volunteer shift, and an acquaintance who's often had some very sharp, cutting, and critical things to say to me, he said to me, nobody appreciates you. and it cut because I recognize that I have created that situation, right? I create a life where it's hard for people to get close to me. And with people who are outside of Orthodox Judaism, it's just so convenient for me to use all the laws of Orthodox Judaism about only eating kosher, etc., to keep people at arm's length. And then within Orthodox Judaism, I use all sorts of other things that are probably too painful to confront and describe to keep other people at arm's length. And I think one reason that I keep other people at arm's length is that I think about the really stupid, dumb, idiotic, hateful, cruel, unnecessary things that I have said publicly on live streams or in my blog posts, and I wince and I get smaller, and I want to withdraw from the world, and I don't want you to know me. And after the Bondi terror massacre, I started blogging up a storm about it, and I did this one post, oy vey, where I just went on and on about the failures of the Australian Jewish leadership, right? Here's the post title. The Bondi Massacre reveals the moral and intellectual bankruptcy of Australia's Jewish leaders. But now, as I was just reviewing this post today, I'm so ashamed of it because it's so messed up, right? There are just so many flaws in it that I think I've corrected now. So I think I'm clean right now, but it was a mess, and I left it up there for 2 weeks. And why was it a mess? Well, chiefly because I asked ChatGPT to use David Pinsos's evolutionary psychology framing from his Substack, Everything is Bullshit, and to analyze on that basis the dumbest things said by Australian Jewish leaders in response to the terror attack. And guess what? Every quote that ChatGPT came back with and every link that it came back with to document its assertions was bogus. And I didn't indent that this was coming from ChatGPT, so it hallucinated, and it's just awful. And then Grok, I asked Grok to do something similar and said really harsh things about Australian Jewish leaders that I don't want to own, and so I'm embarrassed. And then I start thinking, why am I criticizing people in a community that I just want to love and be loved by? And then I think, oh man, all the ways that I keep people at arm's length. And there was this one rabbi at Asia Torah. He very accurately described me as a Torah weirdo. Converts to a new religion, we tend to come from a pretty messed up place where we want to get rid of an unwanted identity and try to create a new identity by embracing a new religion. But what we usually end up doing is taking our messed up psychology and we take that with us everywhere we go, right? You change your religion, but it doesn't necessarily change your insides or your psychology. And there was a bloke, Bill Margold, who I interviewed when I read about the porn industry, and he said that I waved my Judaism around like a bloody flag, right? Nothing like waving a bloody flag around to make people want to get close to you. I was at a Jewish singles lunch at a modern Orthodox synagogue about 20 years ago, and the context here is that I've never been able to sustain a relationship longer than a year. I've never been married. I am a 59-year-old bachelor. So we were sitting in a circle, and the rabbi asked us to say a few sentences about ourselves. And when my turn came, I said, I love irony and sarcasm, When I told it to my therapist later, she said, "Oh, that will really make women want to get close to you." So today I was reviewing some of my blog posts. I think, my God, I must remind polite people of the rantings of some homeless man on Santa Monica's 3rd Street Promenade, right? Who's pushing a shopping cart down 3rd Street Promenade with all of his earthly belongings while screaming about Buffett versus porous identity. Reality, reality, why have you forsaken me? And this homeless man critique, that was the critique that high-credentialed free speech attorney for Vivid Video made about me in a debate we had on, I think, KFI radio about 30 years ago, 25 years ago. Oi. And so why do I forsake reality and then get humiliated? Because I just find the delusion that I'm some great sage just like way too intoxicating. And then I forsake reality. Then I fall on my face and make a total fool of myself. I don't want to hang out here. Let's talk about anything else. This is the Aaron Wren show.
Yeah, it's kind of you know, I spend a lot of my time in work. As a child, I actually
So this is Chris Anod. He's talking here with Aaron Wren. Topic: Why can't America have nice things?
lived in a lot of the third world, and as an adult, that's kind of what I did in banking. Was I kind of focused on Brazil, Argentina, sub-Saharan Africa. And you have in those countries you have these big political divides that are kind of defined by kind of what I would call a kind of an elite minority that kind of separates itself from the majority of the country physically, but also intellectually. And I think that's the case in the U.S. We've had that kind of that would, to me, would be the front row kind of this kind of the cartoonish conservative version is the out of touch kind of academic, but I think it also it cuts it certainly in 2016 it cut across party lines. I think the archetype was kind of in many ways a Jeb Bush and a Hillary Clinton, who were supposed to be the candidates of the time. Right. People forget, who are quite similar in many ways. If you look at their kind of background, they're kind of globalist. Their kind of community is less centered in the U.S. and more centered around the world. As people who are like them, who have they're as comfortable in kind of Geneva as they are in New York City, and they're less comfortable than if you drop them into kind of Selma, Alabama, or kind of or Portsmouth, Ohio. And so that division, that kind of out of touch kind of elite minority, you see that in emerging markets. And so what you get in the politics of these is kind of this cynicism where.
So when you go to Australia or Europe, let alone Japan, it's painful, the higher quality of public spaces and the higher quality of public goods in these countries compared to the United States. Oy, so much pain today, right? I'm in pain as I pontificate. So maybe I just need to embrace my position as the YouTube court fool. So monarchical courts would often have a fool, a jester who would get to say uncomfortable truths because he was a fool and nobody expected him to command any prestige, so he had nothing to lose. Therefore, he was more free to say uncomfortable truths, and that probably reflects my position in life. I have no status or prestige to lose, so that's dangerous on the one hand, but there's also an opportunity that you get to say some uncomfortable truths because you've got much less to lose than your normal person. So fascinating article came out in the LA Times on what went wrong with the Los Angeles Fire Department, why it didn't put out a key fire near the Pacific Palisades. And the reason, they valued plants more than people. So here's the Los Angeles Times report. So an hour after midnight, January 1, 2025, as a small brush fire blazed across Topanga State Park. California State Parks employee texted the Los Angeles Fire Department's heavy equipment supervisor to find out if they were sending in bulldozers. Heck no. That area is full of endangered plants, Captain Richard Deed replied at 9:52 a.m. 5 hours after the Los Angeles Fire Department declared the fire contained, right? Here we have experts, right, declaring the fire contained. And so we want to listen to the experts, right? Heck no. And he continued, I would be a real idiot to ever put a dozer in that area, he wrote. I'm so trained, right? Thank God for training, right? The Los Angeles Fire Department were too trained, too educated, too civilized, too frightened of the greenies, too frightened of rules and procedures and protocols to properly put out the fire. Right? And the details that emerge from depositions and text messages are just absolutely infuriating because they highlight how LA's leaders put a higher priority on vegetation than public safety. And I think there are just so many lessons to learn from this. Right? And this is why this story is just burning up so many people. Right? You have a decision not to use bulldozers, not as an oversight, but as a deliberate choice driven by environmental restrictions. So January 1st, 2025, the Luckman fire started. It was small, it was about 48 acres. And bulldozers are standard for cutting fire breaks, like clearing fuel so fire can't spread. So without them, and with fire crews allegedly restricted from digging deep into the soil to put out smoldering roots, right? They don't want to dig deep because they got to protect these rare plants. The fire wasn't fully extinguished. And then it didn't roar up until about January 7th. So there's basically a 7-day gap. The LA Fire Department declares the fire contained. They leave the scene January 2nd. And crews on the ground reporting to their bosses that the ground was still smoldering and still hot. The department decides not to use thermal imaging drones or devices to check for underground heat, which is standard procedure for these type of root fires. So for a week, the fire burned silently underground in the root systems of these protected plants. Then January 7th, high winds kick up the embers surface and they explode into the massive Palisades fire. And this is a metaphor for Western civilization, right? Notre Dame has been burning for hundreds of years and only now someone finds out when it explodes into literal flames a few years ago. Western civilization's been burning down, but it's burning silently. And then high winds kick up and the embers surface and finally things explode. And so you have a massive right-wing backlash, man. We've got the rise of populism. We've got the Reform Party in the UK. We've got the National Front in France. We've got the Alternative for Germany. All right, you've got Donald Trump getting elected in the United States. So we have all these lawsuits now filed by residents. And there are downsides to having a highly litigious society, but there are also upsides. Because we're such a highly litigious society, we incentivize safety. We incentivize people being careful when they have responsibility, and we incentivize investigations to find out who's at fault. And so these lawsuits show that all these state park officials were physically on scene and essentially preventing firefighters from doing their jobs, because these state park employees are showing firefighters maps of endangered species, right? The Braunton milk vetch. We don't want to let this weed be endangered. And so we have these bureaucrats, these state park employees telling firefighters that they can't dig or use chainsaws in these specific spots. And now the bureaucrats saying, oh, we never had the authority to overrule fire commanders. But the text messages from this LA Fire Department captain saying, I'm so trained. I mean, is that a metaphor for our ruling managerial elite? I'm so trained. Right, suggests that these environmental protocols, these bureaucratic directives are so ingrained that the firefighters effectively police themselves out of doing their own job. How often does this happen? Then the fires reignite, cause massive devastation, destroying homes, killing people, just an absolute disaster. Now, taxpayers are facing billion-dollar class action lawsuits against both the city and the state for negligence, right? Just a textbook example of compliance culture gone wrong, where following a regulation to protect a rare plant becomes more important than the true mission, right? Protecting lives and property. It's a story for our time.
Or you get kind of ping-ponging back and forth between the kind of the angry mob, which is what they're called, versus the kind of elite majority. And they ping-pong back in power. And politics doesn't become about building a cohesive union. It becomes about retribution and corruption. And you see that in the U.S. I mean, I think there's, but first and foremost, it starts with a large inequality. And when I say this, people always say, well, they throw out data about the middle class in the U.S. We've gotten wealthy as a country, and so our poverty rates are shockingly, I should say, are stunningly good, low, and that's good. That's fantastic. We've overall kind of become a much wealthier country, but it's not just about money. It's about kind of social status. It's about kind of cultural issues. I've been saying now for 10 to 12 years that politics is not about economics. It's about cultural issues, and those cultural issues that people in the front row kind of scoff at as things that are back in 2016. Back during the very, I was one of the few people who said Trump was probably going to win back in 2016, and that a lot of that was based on just cultural.
So sometimes the consumer side of me gets the best of me. And a few weeks ago, YouTube TV just gave me an irresistible offer. They gave me Sunday NFL ticket for half a season for just $48. How could I say no? So I bit. I bought it. I signed up. And I haven't watched one single game with the NFL Sunday ticket, in large part because the Dallas Cowboys, my favorite team, have just collapsed. But along with NFL Sunday ticket, they gave me 3 free months of Gemini 3.0. And Gemini 3.0 came out November 18th. And I heard about it pretty much right away because my YouTube and X algorithm is aligned to give me the latest on various AI chatbots because I'm interested in the topic. And up until then, I recognized that ChatGPT was good for some things and that Claude was better at other things. And what the heck, Grok was really good with other things. And then Gemini 3.0 is released. And I read the glowing reviews and then I try it out for myself. And Gemini 3.0 is just so far superior to every other chatbot. It is just miles ahead. One example, I asked on the day of the Bondi terror attack, I asked ChatGPT and Gemini the same question, right? Show me in the news the most dumb thing said by Australian Jewish leaders, and you judge dumb by this template of David Pinsoff's evolutionary psychology. He's a UCLA professor. As articulated in his Substack, Everything is Bullshit. And every single thing that ChatGPT came back to me with was hallucinated, including the links to purported news stories. Then on Friday, I asked Gemini, I asked ChatGPT and Gemini, give me examples of status closure in the news. So every example that ChatGPT came back to me with, including the links to support their examples, with one exception, was hallucinated. Gemini didn't hallucinate once, neither with regard to the Bondi terror massacre and judging dumb by David Pinsoff's evolutionary psychology, and Gemini didn't hallucinate once when it came to examples of status closure in the news. So there you go.
Issues. It wasn't based on money. People would say, "Well, but we're a wealthy country. The poor, the back row has never been wealthier." Though that's true, but they still feel a sense of scorn. They still feel like they're quote out of power, and they still feel like some of the cultural issues or some of the issues that are non-economic are driving their vote. And I think, as I said, almost everybody in the U.S. votes against their economic interest, and if somebody votes against their economic interest, maybe you don't really know what their interest is,
Mm-hmm.
Maybe their interest is in economics. And so I think that also is true in emerging markets. So although, again, we have the advantage of wealth where and in some senses that's made us kind of more prone to fight over the petty things than the fight over the more substantial things.
It seems to me that there are a lot of areas where we're just becoming more dysfunctional.
All right, that's Aaron Wren. He wrote the book on America's anti-Christian turn since approximately the Obergefell decision. Am I going to cover Stephen J. James's streams with Duvid and Elliot. Hadn't planned to. I haven't watched any of them yet. Duvid says, no need for a jester now to say uncomfortable truths because the computer is so much better at it. Okay, so which computer is so much better at it? Because I appreciate Gemini 3.0, but it's still very much a part of high status society. It still smooths a lot of things out. Just last month, Duvid says, I found AI on history and modern issues much better source for truth than experts. It's excellent. Maybe the AI will accurately tell you what the various experts say. Yes, Gemini 3.0 I find is excellent. Everyone was making fun of Luke Ford for talking to AI on a live stream. But Duvid defended Luke, even saying that talking to AI is better than talking to V. Did Luke stop not only displaying the chat online, but reading it? I have to take a break. So I have to turn off my connection to other people to most explicitly say what I believe to be true. But then when I turn off my emotions and my connections, it makes me kind of hard-hearted. So Elliot Blatt is sad yet to hear about Somalian embezzlement on NPR. Well, don't expect NPR to be everything to everyone, right? Everyone belongs in a particular genre. NPR is part of a particular genre, and it's a liberal, elevated, buffered, elite view of life. And so just accept it for what it is, right? I'm a flawed vessel, you're a flawed vessel. If you're a Christian, you should have the attitude, the ground is level at the foot of the cross, right? All the traditions have teachings extolling the virtues of humility. So I think it's okay to accept that we're all flawed. Every source of information has flaws, including ourselves. Whew. I had a writing teacher, Terry Silverman, who said that when you tell the truth, the very molecules in the air around you, it feels like they're changing.
Like a sort of a developing world country. Peter Thiel gave a speech, several years ago where he sort of made a riff on American exceptionalism. He says, yeah, we're exceptional, but we're exceptionally bad. And we're exceptionally overweight. Maybe we have an exceptionally high number of people living in single-family homes or single-parent homes.
So I grew up in Australia, and nobody I knew was divorced. I came to Pacific Union College in the Napa Valley of California, and there was one girl in my class whose parents had divorced, but it was still quite rare. It jumped out at me when I moved to California in 1977, the high percentage of fat people in the United States. It was just noticeable compared to Australia. Now I go back to Australia, and the number of fat people is about the same as in the United States. There are about proportionally per capita about as many psychotherapists in Australia now as in the United States. Divorce, I think, is pretty similar in Australia compared to the United States. So in many ways, America's just 20 years ahead of various social trends compared to Australia. Okay, this Los Angeles Fire Department story, right? It's just a perfect example of what's gone wrong with our credential society. Another thing that jumped out at me when I moved to California in 1977 is how much more credentials were in demand in the United States. It's the most credentialed society, and I think California, out of all the 50 American states, demands more credentials to work than any other place. So it used to be that approximately 75% of jobs in the United States did not require a credential, and that's way down. So with this Pacific Palisades fire story, it's as if it's an example just written for a sociology textbook on the failures of high modernism, right? The failures of the credential society and the paralysis of competence. So sociologist Randall Collins wrote this book in 1979 called The Credential Society. I was listening to it on Christmas Eve on the Poligo app. It's the Netflix of textbooks, because you're not supposed to study Torah on Christmas Eve according to certain rabbis. And so I'm listening to the Credential Society. And in this book, Randall says we've created a system where formal credentials and bureaucratic rank, right, displace practical skill and on-the-ground judgment, tacit knowledge. right? So the connection is the text. I'm so trained, right? That's the smoking gun. The fire captain was not trained in the sense of mastering the physical reality of fire. He was trained in compliance. And I don't know if your experience at work matches mine, but overwhelmingly, you will get along better at work if you comply rather than use good judgment, right? Work tends to overwhelmingly incentivize compliance and checking boxes compared to independent judgment. You'll do much better at getting through the educational system if you simply comply. Much of education is simply an education in compliance and submission. And your life will just be so much easier, and you'll be just so much more successful if you're just compliant in your education and in your work. Right? So we've delegated more and more of the political to the expert, right? We've taken over the past 70 years hot button issues like immigration away from the political and shifted it to the experts. And in the Credential Society, the expert here is the biologist who wrote these regulations. And then the firefighter defers his immediate tactile knowledge that fire spreads, you need bulldozers to stop it. He's deferring, he's complying, he's submitting to the abstract credential knowledge of the environmental protocol. So we have this hierarchy of credentials. And this hierarchy puts endangered species classification at the top and the welfare of people below that. Now, Americans are revolting, and people throughout the developed world are increasingly revolting against this rule of experts by electing populists such as Donald Trump. And so populists in America, in the United Kingdom, in Germany, right, they are tired of the rule of experts. They are tired of the administrative state, of the experts, the scientists, the regulators, performing not just as neutral arbiters as they claim to be, but essentially partisan, ideologically captured class that lacks common sense and is actively at war with its own citizens. You come back to the United States from Australia, you go through customs, and you feel like you're entering a state that is at war with its own citizens. This is just my subjective experience, not necessarily yours, but from the time you fly into LAX to boarding public transport, to dealing with government bureaucracies, or going to the bank, or turning on the TV and getting assaulted with all these ads for PrEP medication. It just feels like every major institution in the country is trying to stick its dick in your ass, and it doesn't feel good, man. I don't like it. Okay, let's bring Claire Khaw onto the show. Claire, what's going on?
I was just complying with your request to join you and help you with your self-loathing, though I don't see that you need help today. You seem cheerful and, rational and, contented enough.
Thank you, because like I did feel the self-loathing, and it was intense, but as you get older, I think you develop, or you should develop, more tools to kind of change it and transmute it and to accept the wisdom and the truth in the self-loathing, but also to put it in its proper place and to, right, you just have more tools. I just feel like I have more tools to deal with my intermittent bouts of self-loathing. I don't know, is self-loathing anything that you experience?
Yes, as an adolescent, certainly. But then that's always a dangerous period for self-loathing, isn't it?
Yeah.
Isn't adolescence the most the peak self-loathing for most people?
And so, but in your present life, when was the last time you felt an intense bout of self-loathing that you remember?
Well, actually, as I get older, I seem to be more accepting of my own flaws, and they seem to be getting fewer, though of course that's purely subjective. But I think in adolescence we expect so much of ourselves, and then realise that we're not, conforming to our own high standards, and that can be very depressing and discombobulating, really.
So how often do you read something you've written in the past or hear something you've said in the past and you think, my God, that was stupid, I'm embarrassed, I'm ashamed?
Um, Well, sometimes I come across my own writings, and I sort of feel a kind of interest, and then I realise it was myself, and sometimes I am a bit horrified at how I seem to come across as being really rather cold and exacting and unfeeling. But then I suppose I should grow into that persona, because sometimes it does generate a reaction that is useful in my line of business, which is promoting a certain message that people detest. But I think as I get older, I am more tolerant of my own foibles than maybe before. Do you find the same thing?
Yes, yes. And so that's why I'm still so chipper as I move through this bout of self-loathing. But at the same time, I reckon here's something that happens to me frequently. I suddenly see myself from another person's perspective, or I kind of empathize and experience how somebody else experiences something that I've said or done, and I react with horror, because even though I think that I had the best of intentions, I realize how careless and cruel something was that I'd said or done when I experience empathy for another person's life experience. Do you experience this like recognition and shock and horror about how someone else might have experienced you?
Yes, I mean, I still feel bad sometimes about the people I've hurt. You know, my own parents, um, I do remember a time when I was I just started my new job, and there was this person who was helpfully, showing me around and showing me the ropes, and because I didn't quite understand, and I was, fairly young, I sort of pretended that I knew it already, and then when I was sacked from that job, I realised how angry she was with me, because she'd given up, she'd stayed late and to show me around, and there was I stupidly saying I knew everything that she was trying to show me, instead of being grateful, and so that taught me a thing or two. That is not always about me, proving that I already knew the thing that I was being told about.
Yeah, I do the same thing. I'm predisposed to communicating. Oh, I've got this. I know this. Right. It tends to feel shameful to me to admit that I don't know something. Like I kind of shrink back from horror internally at admitting I don't know something.
hmm Well, I think I don't mind, because I think a lot it is quite useful to ask questions, and sometimes even if you think you already know the answer, you can get a very surprising and informative answer. But I suppose nowadays maybe I know when to shut up a bit more than I used to before, even though a lot of people still tell me to shut up. But it's I guess you learn from your mistakes about all the times when you should have just kept quiet, and you just couldn't help blurting out whatever was top of your mind at the time.
I think getting fired is one of those traumas that is probably the most difficult to share and to talk about, because if you share or talk about it with anyone, they're very likely to transmit what you shared with someone else, which then like lowers you in group status and very likely to sabotage your work or career trajectory. So there are very strong incentives to just keep quiet about the shame of being fired. And then when
Well,
you keep
yes.
quiet about something, it makes it difficult to process it and get clarity.
Yes, yes, very true. But I suppose it's the same as getting dumped. When it first happens, if you're not expecting it, it's shocking, and you can't even begin to acknowledge it, and it takes a while before you can say, for example, bad news, so and so has died, so and so. And I are no longer friends, or no longer an item, and all these things, just the announcing of it is, very difficult to do.
So something that
But
we
it's a
go
bit
ahead.
like that AA thing, right?
Hmm.
I know people who go to AA meetings for years and years and years, and it's only maybe 7 years later that they dare to stand up and say, my name is so and so, and I'm an alcoholic.
Yeah,
But I
yeah.
can sympathise. I mean, I used to laugh about it, but I do understand
One
now.
thing that I've learned as I've gotten older is that everything leaks out. Right, there are all sorts of things that you think you can hide when you're younger, but eventually, pretty much everything leaks out, and that's how I developed the saying that everything we do affects other people, even if it's in the privacy of our own home.
Yes, yes, it affects ourselves. And also doing so much communication online. I think a lot of people online are basically just saying, ow, ow, I'm hurt. And they're not really making any intelligible proposal or proposition. That they're just saying how they hurt because, something bad has happened to them. But I suppose they only come online to say how terrible it is because in their own social circles it's not accepted to complain, so they come online to communicate their pain anonymously, and that
Now,
seems to fill a
right,
gap.
something we have in common is that we're both we both like talking about uncomfortable topics, and we both operate a great deal online out where the buses don't run no more, outside of polite society. And so I've developed a new theory with regard to this, that inside the beating heart of the biggest dissident, there is always still a yearning, which at any time, at a completely unexpected time, may turn into an overwhelming force to rejoin polite society and to bask in the applause of polite society. So you're a big as dissident as there is, right? And yet I'm sure even inside of you at times there's probably some sort of yearning to rejoin polite
To
society.
be mainstream.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, to be mainstream, to be part of the establishment. Yes. Yes, yes, we all yearn for approval, but then there are so many people who dare not complain, and I think that that's also poisoning them too, not being able to say the cause of our pain, and or even articulate it in sentences. And I suppose that must be the reason for this advice that used to be given. When you're really really angry with somebody, and the advice is you write down how much you hate this person and what they've done wrong, but you don't send that piece of paper with all your hatred on it. You burn it, and even then you will feel better for having expressed all your feelings.
So I remember Dennis Prager would recommend that. He would say if you can't communicate something effectively to your spouse or someone you deeply care about, like sit down and write it out and then send it to them. And in my experience, that was not always such a great thing to do. I remember I did it once with a girlfriend I'd broken up with, and I sent her a long email about how hurt I was. And she told me later when we got back together that she started to read it and then immediately deleted it. But it's a very dangerous thing to do sometimes, to be so explicit with somebody that you care about.
Yes, and it's this desire to explain yourself, in a
Yeah.
case of a breakup, or even some family member, or even you know somebody close to you that you have an argument with. It seems that, oh, but I want to say this other thing that just occurred to me that I failed to say in my 23rd message on the same subject. And I suppose, yes, as I get older, I'm able to stop these things. But before, it seemed, all important to me that I managed to, express all my feelings and listed all my points. But in the end, I suppose it doesn't matter. And yes, we maybe forgive ourselves a bit more for our own foibles, and perhaps are kinder to other people who suffer from the same problems, perhaps.
So what's going on with Stephen J. James? He's back live streaming, but he seemed to have absented himself from the online commentary sphere for some months.
Well, he's doing SJJ Mass, which is a review of Millennial, but then he hasn't had time to read to view most of it. But we've done the new feature, which is in memoriam, which is a new thing for deceased members of the dissident right that might have come our way. And this, I think, will be more interesting as we all get older, I guess. I don't know.
Okay, and is there any new idea that has seized your mental faculties over the past few weeks that you'd like to talk about today?
Well, I think it's all a matter of expressing oneself clearly, succinctly, and consistently. And I find, in talking to a lot of people, that they do not express themselves in a way that can be easily understood, and that's very annoying. And I suppose I've had more practice than others. But yes, communication skills is all important. Perhaps even for our own sakes, we I sort of think it's like expelling waste material, and I tend to think sometimes perhaps I'm just going across the internet excreting bits of my the things the waste material that I need to get off my chest, and that's a reason why I feel better or saner than the other neurotic people that I encounter who cannot seem to express themselves at all in a coherent and intelligible way.
So if you're a regular poster online and you talk about your own experience, in a way you're selling your own soul, right? You are taking some very intimate, painful parts of yourself and retailing them for the world, even though it may be only 50 people who ever pay attention. But that's part of the price of being open online, that there is this somewhat of a sense of selling your own soul. What do you think?
I don't sell my private life. I know a lot of people, particularly middle class people, when they get together on their online communities, I think they're so terrified of saying the wrong thing that all they can do is tell each other very personal things about their lives, which I think is probably not a good idea if you think in terms of people using the information against you. I tend to just state my positions and defend them, and I that gets enough of a churn of a reaction that I don't feel I need to give away private details of myself, and I find myself more comfortable doing that. But those who do this sort of thing, in a way, it's a kind of intersectionality. They want to, particularly women, they want to, tell about their, terrible trauma, their, their exes or their children, behaving badly and that kind of thing, and they seem to think it gives them status to speak in these terms. But I try not to give personal details of my life. Because I think there's enough there to be getting on with.
So sometimes I read books and they really stick with me. And there was one book I read a few years ago by a philosopher named John M. Doris, and his point was that the situation will often affect us more than any other factor. And one application of that I've come to more clarity on recently is that in conversation, people overwhelmingly just say what is expected of them, which essentially renders conversation, with just the rarest exceptions, absolutely useful for the pursuit of truth. People just say what is expected of them. So if people are in a right-wing setting, they'll say something right-wing. People are in a Christian setting, they'll say the Christian thing that is expected of them. If it's in a traditional Jewish setting, they'll say the Orthodox Jewish thing. And conversations are essentially just people overwhelmingly saying what is socially expected of them rather than anything interesting or brave.
Yes, and I guess in a real life social setting, I think I probably would do this sort of thing. But sometimes I find myself able to insert a few of my my radical political views, but by well, not actually making statements so much as asking questions, which seems a safer way of operating, because a question can be answered yes or no, while making statements can be quite dangerous, I suppose.
So, what do you think is a lesson or two that we should take away from the Bondi terror attack 2 weeks ago?
Well, I've heard some time ago political commentators on geopolitics that a lot of these things will be false flag attacks. I don't actually know the details of the Bondi Beach thing, but it seems a little, well, having a Hanukkah celebration on the beach seems particularly un-Jewish. I don't know if you agree with that. It doesn't, chime in with my expectation of Jewish behavior, because I think they do it in the synagogue and they wouldn't be doing it, on the beach, and that would antagonize a lot of people. And this reminds me of recently how a white nationalist type person was saying that he was delighted and surprised that anti-Semitism seems to have gone mainstream. Those were his words. So I
Right.
guess if I were
So
Jewish, I'd
Hanukkah is
be more
one of those.
circumspect.
Yeah, Hanukkah is one of those rare Jewish celebrations that does have a considerable public component. So, for example, you're supposed to put your Hanukkah where it can be seen from the street. It's not something that you hide. And so this was a very real event. I've been to similar events in that community when I was there, and it was a real event with real people who I know who were murdered, real people who were injured. It's a horror that particularly hit home for me because I know both the event, the community, the people, the situation, and it just it has just preoccupied me for the past 2 weeks. Okay, anything that you want to talk about before I move on?
Well, I was going to say that the whole thing in the Middle East, it's really a religious war, and nobody quite wants to admit it. But I think that is what it is in reality. It is a religious war. I mean, not even the Iranians want to admit it. That they want to say, "Oh, Israel has nothing to do with Judaism, and we don't hate all Jews. It's the uh, but we hate Zionists." But this is logic chopping, and maybe it's too nuanced for most people. But yes, it is about the meaning of words, and it's very difficult to convey these things. Without finding oneself giving an hour-long lecture on the meaning of words. So, and most people won't have the attention span to listen the whole way through, which is sad.
Well,
But
I
that's
think
all I want.
I think it's primarily a tribal conflict where the religious component may be easier to talk about than the purely tribal component. So those Jews who live in Israel and aren't remotely religious are just as much the enemy to the surrounding Arab Muslim cultures than those Jews who are religious. So those Muslims who are leading secular lives, right, are just as much an enemy to the Jewish state that's trying to protect itself from its enemies as religious Muslims. So I think, as in Northern Ireland, which is often billed as a Protestant Catholic divide, the religious identification is simply an ethnic signifier. And I think increasingly in our secular age, religion primarily acts as an ethnic signifier rather than being the thing in itself. I don't think it is primarily a theological battle either in Northern Ireland or in the Middle East.
Well, that's only because Christians don't really take Christianity seriously. Recently, King Charles was praying with the Pope in Rome. So obviously, it's not a big deal, but then it has caused a kind of Christian identity crisis because well, Christians can't agree on anything, and I think that the whole thing about white nationalism. I remember years ago saying, well, we can't agree on any principles, but we can agree on who is or isn't white, and that's why they focus on the racial issue rather than the principles of Christianity and Christian identity, which is liable to cause even more problems when Christians try to decide on it. But then the problem, it also affects Jews and Muslims who don't agree with each other on anything either. And I think the danger is that they don't have accountable political leadership, so nothing can be solved because all the Abrahamic religions suffer from the two Jews, two Christians, two Muslims, but three opinions kind of problem.
Okay, thanks, Claire. Thanks for stopping by.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, take care. So one thing that is good about getting older is you feel less and less need to take people at their word, right? We usually don't say what we mean. We don't usually mean what we say. If we have self-awareness, we realize how much of the things we say we don't mean, and how many of the most important things that we mean we do not say. So just because someone, say, identifies as Christian or Muslim or identifies with this or that identity doesn't mean that that is truly what's driving them. So when we see failures such as with the Pacific Palisades fire in Los Angeles, and we see the rise of populism, and we see increasing antipathy to the administrative state and to the rule of experts, this emerges because the administrative state and experts doesn't feel, to at least many Americans and many people in Europe, as though it's serving the public interest. And so this specific text exchange, heck no, endangered plants, so we're not going to make sure the fire is put out. It could serve as a campaign ad for the anti-expert, anti-administrative state, anti-deep state movement, right? It validates the core accusation that the expert class prioritizes all these abstract virtues, such as saving some kind of milk vetch over concrete goods, saving lives and saving homes. So when Trump and other populists argue that the bureaucrats are killing us, the experts are killing us, the deep state is killing us, the administrative state is killing us, right? They can point to this, right? Here they can point to a literal fire. They don't have to use complex economic metaphors, right? Here, the expert consensus of environmental protection fueled the destruction of the Pacific Palisades, right? This makes the war on experts look less like a war on science, more like a war for survival against a deranged bureaucracy. Last week, I was talking about status closure, right? You work hard, you try to move up, and then you are blocked from moving up because you have the wrong accent, or you lack credentials, or you're morally suspect because you're not all in on gay marriage. And so we have all these environmental regulations that essentially create a closed status group where the values of the group, biodiversity, right, are hermetically sealed from the values of the public, right, public safety, right? The firefighter could not break into the closed logic of the state park's mandate, right? The status of this particular plant, this weed, was legally codified as higher than the status of people. So the agency maintained its internal purity, right? No plants were harmed by bulldozers, and as a result, the Pacific Palisades burned and people died. Right? This is the ultimate failure of status closure, when the preservation of the ruling elite's internal rules leads to the destruction of the society that hosts the ruling elite. Now, status closure can be a force for the public good when it reinforces and protects expertise that is real expertise that is demonstrated in the public interest. So the Pacific Palisades fire and the failure of the Los Angeles Fire Department to act because it was concerned about violating some environmental protections, it's also a demonstration of the power of Charles Taylor's buffered versus porous identity, right? The porous self is the pre-modern self, open to the world, vulnerable to spirits and forces and devils and angels, right? The porous self lives in a world that is enchanted and dangerous. The buffered self means that the most important things in life are inside of you. You get to decide right and wrong. You get to be strategic and autonomous and rational. You're protected by boundaries, by rules, a sense of disengagement. You can view the world through a screen of science and law and safety. And these text messages reveal a classic buffered response to a porous threat. And when you go to war with reality, reality always wins. The buffered identity is a war with reality. Now, sometimes taking on a fictional identity, such as the buffered identity, will serve the public good and it will serve your personal good or communal good. There are situations where the fictional buffered identity is very useful to put on, such as often at work. You want to come across as buffered. But fire is porous reality. It is raw, it is elemental, it is indifferent to these boundaries. So the bureaucratic response here, the response from the Los Angeles Fire Department, the state parks, right, was buffered, right? They tried to manage a chaotic elemental force with a checklist and a legal distinction, right? This is state parks land. This is not city land. And the captain's text, I'm so trained, that's the cry of the buffered self, believing that rules constitute reality. But the map is not the territory, right? Rules are not going to, in and of themselves, constrain fire or any other anarchy.
That's he didn't exactly say that one, but you can say there are a lot of areas now where we're like an outlier in a negative way. And one of them that I think you commented on is like, our public transit, some of our public amenities, where we always see these pictures of gleaming transit systems in other countries, and even in like not especially wealthy countries, they have like highly functional public transit.
Right. There are a lot of countries where I would rather be stuck and stuffed, just be in public transport that is jammed, but there aren't violent, dangerous people around me, right? I can still feel safe, but you can ride public transport in American cities and it's deadly dangerous, right? There are people in the midst of hallucinations and drug and alcohol intoxication and just very violent, deadly people who've been arrested 15 different times and then released. And even if there's lots of space, it's still incredibly dangerous compared to being jam-packed on a train from Bondi. So I read in the prestigious press about the importance of bureaucratic independence. The Federal Reserve, it needs to be independent from political control. But when you have the EPA and these various regulatory agencies operating independently, then they're only essentially accountable to themselves. They're not accountable to the executive branch, they're not accountable to the legislative branch, and they're not accountable to the judicial branch. You can't usually sue a bureaucrat. And so there are advantages to conferring independence, right? If you have an employee who knows he can't be fired, there are theoretically advantages that come from that. But generally, you will get a worse work performance if the employee knows he can't be fired easily. And this type of disastrous reaction to a fire provides all sorts of incentives to end deference to independent agencies. Right? We have the Chevron defense that is legal doctrine already weakened by the U.S. Supreme Court. And when it was a dominant legal ruling, it said that courts must defer to independent bureaucratic agency interpretations. But this Chevron deference now should be mocked in the court of public opinion. You have the unitary executive arguments, right? Argument that we need to bring all these independent agencies under the direction of someone who is elected by the people, by the president, right? This is what happens when agencies are independent. They go rogue, they save some weed, and as a consequence, people die and communities burn, right? And so we need someone accountable to take control of these independent agencies. So we have all sorts of incentives here to move towards more outcome-based regulation, right? Did the fire get put out rather than process-based regulation? Did you fill out the environmental impact form? Currently, it seems like in at least American politics, the focus on the right, on the popular side, is much more on the ends and the public good. And the focus of the managerial elite and the experts and the most highly educated is much more on process. So you have this LA Fire Department captain saying, I'm so trained. And it's haunting because it sounds like a boast. But really, it's a confession of intellectual surrender. Right? This is a fundamental truth about modern labor that sociologists have been warning about for decades. Right? The economy and the experience of work has shifted from rewarding results. Did the fire go out to rewarding process? Did you check the right box? Did you fill out the environmental impact form? And so in most workplaces, it seems to me, the box checker usually defeats the thinker. The LA fire department captain here, he is the rule. He's not the exception, right? If you check the box, you are audit proof. We have a work bureaucracy, whether it's a fire department or corporation, that is aligned to provide incentives to check boxes, right? Not necessarily aligned to succeed, but to avoid liability. The primary reason people get fired is because they create liability. It's not because they don't think about the general interest, the wider interest, the corporate interest, right? Increasingly, workers are incentivized not to think and just check boxes. So if someone thinks and uses a bulldozer to save the Pacific Palisades, but in the process he crushes some rare plant, right? The agency gets sued, the fire department captain gets sued, right? If the thinker fails, they will be personally blamed for going rogue. You need to just do your job. Stop thinking. I would often get caught on the carpet for thinking, and my boss would say, I don't pay you to think, right? I pay you to do what I say, right? So if the box checker lets the Pacific Palisades burn down and people burn up, but he follows protocol, he's safe. He can stand before a review board. He can point to the manual and he say, I followed the procedure. The procedure absorbs the blame. The box checker is legally legible. The thinker is a legal liability. The captain was so trained in the art of liability avoidance. Right? People who get promoted will tend to be people who are box checkers, who push problems down the chain of command and pull the credit up. And so the thinker is dangerous because the thinker asks difficult questions like, why are we doing it this way? This rule makes no sense. Thinkers create friction. The box checker removes friction. They move paper from pile A to pile B and they don't generate any noise. So most work systems will reward smoothness over substance. They will reward the box checker over the thinker. We tend to have work protocols that reward paper knowledge and rather than tacit knowledge. What you know is really happening based on reading between the lines rather than what is explicitly said. The I'm so trained mentality represents the total victory of explicit codified knowledge over tacit instinctual knowledge. Right? The firefighter looks at the brush and knows this is going to explode if we don't cut a line now with bulldozers. Codified knowledge. The regulation states no mechanized equipment in zone 4. So we've built a world where we only trust what is written down and codified. And because you cannot write down gut instinct or common sense in a way that satisfies a compliance officer, those traits are devalued and the box checker becomes the avatar of codified knowledge.
And then we had this horrific killing in Charlotte on the light rail line. It just seems like, quite apart from just dangerousness, which we have, it just seems like this idea, it's this disorder. Things don't work here. Our public health infrastructure didn't really work during the pandemic.
So the person who checked on Muhammad Atta onto an airplane on 9/11, he checked the box. He was so scared of being accused of Islamophobia or racism, even though he sensed this burning hatred coming from the guy, he checked the box. He followed the procedure. He didn't think, right? If he'd thought, if he'd had the courage of his convictions, right, the death toll of 9/11 could have been dramatically reduced. All right, let's get Michael back onto the show. Michael, what's going on, man?
40, how are you?
I am blessed.
Nice. So yeah, I've really enjoyed your last couple of shows. I actually downloaded one of them as a podcast. So your show is available as a podcast. I don't know if your viewers knew that, but it's great to download podcasts. Like if you're going to be in a non-internet area. And I've never been a big podcast guy, ironically. Like I obviously listen to a lot of content on YouTube, but I've never been one to like search, what's the podcast I'm going to listen to?
Interesting.
But
what was it? Anything that you care to share about how wonderful my recent shows were?
Well, okay. So, I mean, I love the discussion about the Jacob Savage article, The Lost Generation. But when you started the show, I almost thought, wow, I strongly disagree with 40 here. But as the show unfolded, it was pretty clear that you knew the score on that topic of, white males being shut out of prestige industries such as writers, novelists, professors in the humanities, and so forth. So, but you initially said,
Yeah. Let me just jump on that. Remember, we all live in a society, and I'm strongly incentivized by society to say this is their own fault. So go ahead.
Yeah, me too. And Jacob Savage is incentivized to do that as well. And some people took issue with his conclusion that, well, I should have realized sooner that trying to become a writer for TV was not a realistic thing for me. And I should have been more mature and just found a regular job sooner. And people found that conclusion to be not strident enough. But as you said, I think he did quite enough just to describe the issue and to lay out the facts, so much so that it was just discussed in Washington Post and the New York Times. What else do you want from the guy?
Yes, and it's wrong to expect everything in one piece, right? You have to understand the genre and the incentives that he's working in.
Yeah, exactly. But he also wrote a piece a few months ago about the same topic, but just strictly focusing on novelists and writers. Likewise, laying out evidence showing, who the awards went to. And so, yeah, you wouldn't want to be a white male novelist because you probably won't get your novel published. Or if you do, it will be extremely self-flagellating and it will not be a good look.
So I wanted a TV show last night, and even though I've got like 6 different series that I'm started on, I started a new one, and it's called The Closer. Came out in 2004, and it's about a new female officer commander in the Los Angeles Police Department and how she has to deal with all sorts of anti-female discrimination and cruelty and rude comments. And started thinking, I have seen 100 different TV shows and movies about anti-female bias and discrimination. Are there any TV shows and movies about anti-male bias? No, there aren't. And there are very few novels. You would be hard pressed publishing a novel with a prestigious press about anti-male hostility, and it exists, but men don't like to talk about it because it makes them look weak, and it marks you socially as a bad person, and it's just not as easy to necessarily dramatize and monetize. But why do you think there are no movies, no TV shows, no novels of note about anti-male bias?
Well, I mean, the question answers itself, but like you said earlier, I'm not really looking for a book about race per se, or that that proposes a different perspective. I just want a normal story or a normal novel, and God forbid it might be written by a white male, that just as you say, describes his own experience. And the last time I can think of that is probably John Updike, the Rabbit novels. And when you go back and you read those novels, first of all, they're wonderful. They're just great stories, but they're very kind of unapologetically of that perspective, and not even necessarily John Updike's perspective. I mean, that's, of course, you can't confuse the views of a protagonist with that of the author, but nonetheless.
Yeah, it's kind of a painful thing to talk about. It's like talking it's failure, right? It's a painful thing for men to talk about. You don't want to talk publicly about getting fired or not getting hired or being passed over, because it makes you sound like a whiner and a loser.
Yeah, exactly. But I think he did a great job. I mean, the essay itself is like a work of literature almost, 10,000 word essay that everyone is talking about. Although we might exaggerate the extent to which just your average Joe Sixpack is aware of that article. because
Right.
I made a video about it, and I posted on YouTube and TikTok and whatnot, and not quite as comprehensive as your shows, but I had people in the comments like, source, show me the source. I said, well, here's the article I'm discussing, and then the responded immediately just with another talking point. I'm like, you just proved my point, man. Like, I didn't actually argue with him because I don't do that, but you proved my point that don't ever bring this to a leftist because they will not accept it no matter how much evidence and how many statistics that you marshal. They don't care.
Well, ironically, Jacob phrased it in a way that it is socially acceptable for someone, certainly center left, to talk about.
Yeah, and I'm perfectly sympathetic to that perspective. So if that brings him around to not being a Democrat, not being a leftist, then I would welcome such a person with open arms. Speaking of white male writers, I've been reading Gore Vidal. He did a lot of historical fiction.
Yes.
And I've always been aware of Gore Vidal, but it's a pretty good novel. Let's see. The Smithsonian Institute by Gore Vidal, 1999. It's not really a novel that works 100%, but what a great writer.
Yes. I'm not sure if I've read any of his novels, but to the extent that I've listened to him, or I've certainly read excerpts of things that he's written, he is certainly gifted, eloquent, every bit the equal in his verbal gifts as William F. Buckley.
Exactly. Yes. So I would like to kind of delve more into his work, Gore Vidal. Maybe listen more to his interviews and whatnot. But yeah, sometimes a book, like the plot is not great, but since they're an excellent writer, you can kind of still just keep reading. That's kind of where I am with this novel. Kind of like For Whom the Bell Tolls by Ernest Hemingway. Although I kind of paused that after 500 pages, but it's like this story is actually almost horrible. Like it's going nowhere for hundreds of pages, but still it's cool to read because it's Hemingway. So just the aesthetic experience of his prose is almost enough.
So in Dissident Right spaces over the past 10 years, there is glee whenever anyone gets triggered. Triggered shows that you're less of a man. It shows that you're weak and that you've been bested. And you have to say, looking at the Gore Vidal, William F. Buckley debates, particularly when Buckley erupted and called Gore Vidal a queer, and he was always calling Gore Vidal a queer privately.
I literally just watched that.
Right. Buckley was triggered, and Gore Vidal was the superior debater, and Buckley humiliated himself, and he won on points, or he won on a knockout, depending on how you view it. But I don't think there's any way you can view those debates and not conclude that Gore Vidal got the best of Buckley.
Yeah. I just watched a short with that clip, so I'm not in a position to evaluate the debate because it's been a few years since I watched it. But there was a certain finesse with which Buckley said that he would punch him in the face until he's plastered.
Yes.
I can't even imitate it, but it was the most gentlemanly threat I've ever heard in my life.
It's kind of weird that Buckley would speak with a British accent, right? He was such a formative figure. Like he had no basis in real life to have this British accent. His recondite choice of vocabulary, he was just. No. His wife said after that debate, "Great, now there are 180 million Americans who believe that I'm married to a flaming homo."
Really?
Yeah.
Well, I could understand why you would say, why does he have that accent? But because I'm from that area, Greenwich, Connecticut, there are people from not necessarily this generation, but from that generation who would indeed speak that way without, I wouldn't necessarily call it an affectation, you know? It's very high society over there.
But Bill Buckley was incredibly affected, even if you don't agree with that particular example, which I think is overwhelming. He was incredibly affected. He would use the most recondite words for no good reason. He was always performing, preening, and he embodies this quality that is dominant in right-wing commentary of camp. Right? This is not the dominant quality of left-wing commentary. Right-wing commentators are overwhelmingly incredibly campy.
Well, I mean, he was a wordsmith, so why can't he show it off a little bit? I think if you're good at it, then it doesn't strike me as an affectation. But there are writers, especially conservative writers, that are reaching for the thesaurus when they're writing, and they're not good writers, and they look ridiculous and they sound ridiculous. But if you're smart enough, then that's just doing your craft.
So do you think he was campy?
I don't know. I don't. No. I have just like a positive perspective on William F. Buckley. But back to Gore Vidal, like he wrote historical novels. So if you're someone like you and me are not necessarily reading novels all the time. However, if it's a historical novel, it's like you're learning a little bit about history while you're at it. So, so in this novel, you got Charles Lindbergh in there. It's basically 1939, and they're trying to figure out how to preempt or stop the war from breaking out, and they're trying to invent a atomic bomb which only destroys buildings and not people, something like that. It doesn't even make sense, but it's cool how he integrates the characters, like I said, like Lindbergh and Abraham Lincoln, Oppenheimer. So and Lindbergh is not portrayed negatively, so I suspect that Gore Vidal is maybe a little based too.
There was a very telling comment by someone at National Review. So when you're around someone on a regular basis, you often get a much more precise reading. And there was an editor at National Review who remarked, it was a good thing that the Communist Manifesto was not well written, or Bill Buckley would be a communist. Like Bill Buckley just loved glib writing, and that's what he produced. And I just feel like that's such a telling comment about Buckley. Like he went for the affected. I strongly recommend this new biography of Buckley. And if people wonder what I mean by campy, because I didn't know how to define it when I was just talking to you, it's an absurdly exaggerated, artificial, and affected manner of presentation. And it just it's so interesting to me that it's dominant on the right and it's virtually absent among certainly the most prestigious members of the left. But the highest status talking heads and pundits on the right are just absurdly campy. Just absurdly artificial, exaggerated, and affected.
Well, I could definitely agree with you that the way that a lot of conservative writers write is extremely annoying, and they use words that you would never hear in real life, but they just repeat it. Like one of them is feckless.
Yes.
Like Barack Obama's feckless foreign policy. Everything is feckless. And meanwhile, it's just so unnatural. Like those guys, the way they write at National Review nowadays, for example, is garbage. It's garbage. It's very affected.
Do you know who Rick Perlstein is?
Rick Perlstein.
Yeah.
He's an author, right?
He's a left-wing
He wrote about
author
Nixon.
who wrote a bunch of books on Nixon and Reagan.
Yeah.
He's a really good writer. He's an excellent writer, and he's also sometimes very prescient critic of conservatism. And he wrote this brilliant essay in November 2012 for the Baffler, and it's called The Long Con, Mail Order Conservatism. And he just looks at the products that are sold by the leading right-wing publications, and they are the most dubious products. I mean, there are so many financial scams, just terrible, terrible investments that underwrite much of right-wing commentary. And then the supplements that are routinely seem to be the number one source of right-wing advertising are just so highly dubious that he's got a really good point that the funding, the advertising for so much of right-wing talk radio and for right-wing publications is just so low class, trashy, scammy, disgusting.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think there's a certain element of contempt for their own audience. And you almost have to have that a little bit. Like if you're running a news website, you're like, okay, people are going to click on this. Throw Ilhan Omar on there. Like, let's talk about the squad again. People will click on this. So if you're trying to reach a mass audience, there's going to be a little bit of that.
What do you think about this evolutionary psychology idea, which I stumbled upon by UCLA professor David Pinsoff? He writes a terrific Substack. It's called Everything is Bullshit. And here's the essence of his work. If a practice doesn't confer an evolutionary reproductive advantage, it is not what it says it is. It's essentially a status game. And it's just such a clear way of understanding the world. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, that checks out. But if I actually want to ask you one more thing, which is that you feel I'm being too agreeable here. Let me get back to my disagreement with you. That's actually not one of my faults, is being too agreeable, I'm told. But you suggested that Jacob Savage did not get a job as a TV writer, as he describes, because it's just an unrealistic kind of career goal, and that he's falsely attributing that to being a white male, and he's delusional to have expected that. Or
No,
is that tongue in
I want to
cheek?
just amend that a little bit. He
Yeah.
said that he was told, instructed that if you simply follow these steps, you can become a TV writer. And
Okay.
I'm making the point, nobody seriously in the world of reality has told him that if you who has a reason to say, has a basis of saying this, that if you just follow these steps, you'll become a TV writer who can earn a six-figure income and support a family. That he was claiming something that did not exist in reality, that only existed in his imagination, which was at war with reality. Nobody
Right.
seriously can claim that if you just follow these 6 steps, you can become a TV writer with a six-figure income and support a family.
Right. Yes, certainly not. It would be, as he says, a prestige job. However, just where he describes himself as being in his career, it would seem that he was kind of primed to be in that career, that there was really no problem, that he knew the people you needed to know, and he had the resume you needed, and he was all about to be hired until he was explicitly told, like, we're doing racial preferences and that's why we're not hiring you.
I agree with that. And I also don't believe him when he says that he was essentially instructed that if you just do this. He argues at one point, look, I just followed directions. I was told, I followed orders that if you do this, you can become a TV writer. I don't agree with that. But I also simultaneously, I agree with what you said. It seems from the story of his career that we know that he did have rational reason to believe that he was going to become a TV writer. On the other hand, nobody can claim that even if you go to an Ivy League school, that if you just follow the following steps, you can have assurance that you will get this kind of high status job. It's just way too perilous. And the notion that we've got a generation that's been raised to believe that if you just work hard, you'll succeed is not true. Working hard means nothing. If you have any experience in the workplace, you know that you can work hard all day long. And if your effort is not aligned with what your employer wants, you'll get fired, you'll get demoted, you're not going to move ahead. So this notion that people are told, look, just do the right things and then great things will be given to you. If do the right thing is defined as working hard, is delusional to me.
Yeah. Well, and you have to be a good writer. I mean, self-evidently, he is a good writer, so that helps. And some people fashion themselves as writers, and they're not good writers. They just keep going and going, and you see their byline, and you just know, okay, I'm not even clicking on that. But like wanting to be a TV writer is not like wanting to be a movie star. I mean, it's not wanting to be a rock star. It's like kind of realistic goal. It's not a crazy goal to go for. But I'm sure it's difficult and competitive, but not, or at least previously it was not undoable.
In the current age, right? It's 99.8% like being a movie star. I mean, how many people do you think earn a six-figure income writing for TV? We're talking maybe 200 people?
Yeah, I don't know. And then the flip side of it is don't assume that you're an undiscovered genius being discriminated against, and only for your race and gender are you not having fame and fortune, because there are some people that seem to be under that delusion, and unfortunately the system allows them to persist in this kind of grandiose vision of themselves, when in some cases maybe you didn't get the job because you're actually not a good writer.
Well, there's just so many variables in the world of entertainment. I remember I went out to the Writers Guild of America picket line when they were protesting in 2007, and I was awkwardly framing a question to a TV writer, and he said to me, "What you're asking is, are we just rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic?" And he was so much more succinct, but that is it. It is not a viable income for everyone, but a tiny, tiny number of people, maybe 200, 300, I don't know, 400 people max a year in the United States can earn a six-figure income writing for TV.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true. So one final note, I changed my channel name to Michael M. History. I think kind of fits me a little bit better. Not that I'm necessarily talking about history all the time, but I just realized that the word vlog these days really does have a kind of feminine connotation. It's a little low status, and it doesn't really match what I do. I mean, I'm usually talking about news, politics, and history or literature. So
it doesn't match what you do. It doesn't match who you are. You're a high status individual, but you're gonna up the camp factor, bro. You gotta up the camp factor. You gotta become absurd and exaggerated.
I'm trying, man. I'm trying. But I can also go the route of dry humor, and that's like the opposite.
Yes, my friends tell me that you have a quiet charisma.
That's cool. I appreciate that. So thanks to the non-haters in your audience, and I will sign out with that. Thanks, Forty.
Okay, blessings. Good to talk to you, mate.
Right.
Okay, let me catch my breath here.
What do you see in terms of the U.S. as sort of a functional society with functional services compared to other countries that you experience?
Yeah, so in the last 4 or 5 years, I've been doing what I did in the U.S. or around the world, and so I've been traveling a lot, and I've written. Most of my focus has been writing on the rest of the world, and yeah, I mean, I have a series of pieces called "Why the U.S. Can't Have Nice Things," and we don't have nice things. The common good, so to speak, that we have is much better in Europe, and it's much better in poorer countries. We're immensely wealthy, but we're also immensely kind of prone to kind of ignore the common good. Our public. I ride buses everywhere. If I'm not walking, I'm riding buses. I rode Greyhound buses from.
Right. No. None of my peers would want to be caught anywhere near public transportation in Los Angeles. And that was a bigotry and a prejudice that I had for many years. Any comments on the two-way split and the Dan Turrentine, Sean Spicer spinoff? Well, I watched both shows. I liked them equally, and I am curious why these people parted ways. So if anyone has any information about the split, I would love to know it. So the system that we have right now in probably most workplaces is that thinking creates friction. Thinking creates debate. Thinking requires nuance. And if you are successful as a thinker in a workplace, it makes you more difficult to replace. And work has all these incentives where you really want people to be as replaceable as possible, right? A large organization such as the state of California requires standardization, right? They want every employee to be a replaceable cog. And if you're a thinker, you're not easily replaced. If you quit, right, you create friction. If you stay, you create friction. If you're a box checker, you're interchangeable. So the system prefers box checkers because that makes organizations scalable. You can't scale genius or thinking or common sense. You can scale a checklist. So the Los Angeles Fire Department captain was behaving exactly as a scalable unit of bureaucracy would want. Be predictable, be compliant, be uniform. So think about the difference between the job and the work. So the work is the task, putting out the fire. Right? The job is the social role, being a captain. So for the thinker, the work is what matters. For the box checker, the job is what matters.
From New York City to Chicago the last time I came here in piecemeal, and that's where I stopped in Indianapolis again for a day. I think I came from I forgot where I'd come from. I came from Columbus, Ohio. I went from New York to Harrisburg to Pittsburgh, Pittsburgh to Columbus, Columbus to Indianapolis, Indianapolis to Fort Wayne to here, in Greyhound buses. And when you see the cities in that way, when you're kind of dropped off at the Greyhound stop, and just walking around downtown in Indianapolis, that kind of or just staying down there, it's depressing. We have this kind of stubborn part of the back. One of my disservices of my book was the back row was lumped into one entity. It's not. There's degradation. There's different back rows, and then there's effectively the working poor, then there's the dependent poor, and they're very, very different. They have the same mentality in terms of the worldview, but their situation is very different. And we have a very stubborn dependent poor in the U.S. who, are causing a lot of problems, and they're in a lot of pain themselves. You don't have to spend.
So think more about the difference between the work and the job. So the captain failed at the work, which is fighting and extinguishing fire, but he excelled at the job, following the rules of being a captain. So he is rewarded with a job, with a paycheck, and he is protected by his rank because he prioritized the job over the work. He prioritized checking a box as opposed to saving lives. Status closure, right, explains why the box checker is protected and the thinker is expelled. It's not about laziness. It's not about right and wrong. It's about protecting the group's power. So think about compliance culture and how it closes off status, right? You have a guild of compliance. Status closure happens when a group monopolizes resources by creating strict criteria for who's in and who's out. And all groups have criteria, right? You get status by being good at the work. That's the old way to status, right? By putting out fires effectively. The new way, the modern way, is you get status by mastering the code, by knowing the environmental regulations and being compliant and submissive and following orders and checking boxes. So the more complex you make the rules, right? Things like the Endangered Species Act, Coastal Commission variances, liability statutes, right? The bureaucratic class closes off the profession. You cannot just be a brave, smart firefighter. You must be a legal scholar of vegetation to move ahead. So this excludes the thinker who relies on the tacit, who relies on common sense, because common sense is accessible to everyone. If you get to master obscure regulations, then you will demonstrate that you've been trained. You're submissive, right? Saying, I'm so trained, that means I am a member of the club. Captain text, I'm so trained. He wasn't saying I'm skilled. He wasn't saying I'm acting in the public interest. He was saying he was a member of this particular status group. He was telling his superiors, I am one of you. I speak your language. I value, and I obey, and I submit to your rules more than I do to fighting fires. So if the thinker had bulldozed the line to save the town, he would have been treated as a barbarian. He was an outsider who didn't respect the sacred text of environmental regulation. The thinker will consistently get cast out, not because they failed, not because they didn't serve the public good, but they disrespected the hierarchy of values that give bureaucracy its power. Being a thinker makes you dangerous.
You don't have to spend too much time in Vietnam or Indonesia or Mongolia to see how bad we have it, how much kind of disorder and how much kind of filth and how much kind of violence we accept. Mongolia is really poor, but
Yeah.
and yet they have better. I feel more comfortable on a bus in Mongolia than I do in kind of like on a bus in Indianapolis.
So they're dancing around some very awkward parts that they don't want to talk about, the most dangerous antisocial elements that create these disruptions. Right, so think about the moralization of procedure. Status groups always try to frame their exclusive prerogatives as examples of moral superiority. So think about the moral high ground that the box checker operates under, right? The box checker says, I'm following the law. I'm protecting the environment. I respect diversity, right? So the box checker gets to wrap their bureaucratic inaction in the flag of virtue while the Pacific Palisades burns down and people die. Think about the vulnerability of the thinker. The thinker, by prioritizing saving lives, saving homes, by putting a priority on practical results, he comes across as reckless. He's a cowboy. He's a Pinchas from the Torah. He's anti-regulation. Right? So the box checker gets to feel morally superior to the person who saves lives. Right? This LAFD captain felt like he was the good man, the good employee, because he protected plants, even though, as a result, the Pacific Palisades burned down. And the ultimate privilege of being a box checker is you get to be insulated from reality. You get to ignore reality and you don't lose your job, you don't lose your status, and you don't lose your pension. Right? The public faces the porous reality of a fire burning out of control, destroying homes and killing people. But the in-group, the bureaucracy, they get to live in this buffered reality of reports, texts, hearings, environmental regulation. The box checker is protected. The thinker who acts in the public good, he's vulnerable. As long as the paperwork is correct, right, the outcome, right, the death of dozens of people, the destruction of hundreds of homes, that's unfortunate, but it's unavoidable. The thinker who engages with reality is at risk. He's vulnerable. If he succeeds, he won't get credit. If he fails, he will get all the blame. So workplaces inevitably enforce compliance culture, right? This is a tool the administrative class uses to maintain status closure against the uncredentialed but competent, right? It ensures that a mediocre person follows the rules, will always do better, always outrank a brilliant person who questions them, right? The I'm so trained text, that's the password required to stay inside the safety of your employment. And if you want to read some philosophy on this topic, then consult the work of Stephen Park Turner, right? He published a book, The Social Theory of Practices, Tradition, Tacit Knowledge, and Presuppositions. So he's a skeptic of collective practices. He says there's no such thing as a group mind or a shared practice, it's only individual habit. So Stephen Turner talks about why training fails. Turner asks, how does tacit knowledge, right, the ability to read reality, the ability to read a fire, how does it get passed on from a master to an apprentice, right? You cannot speak, you cannot codify, you cannot publish tacit knowledge. If you could, it would be explicit and not tacit, right? So you'll see this in Orthodox Judaism. The Balei Tshuva, the newcomers to Orthodox Judaism, will often get their directions from books, while those who are raised inside Orthodox Judaism, they will get their direction primarily from human transmission. It will largely be tacit, not explicit. So bureaucracies cannot transmit the feel of the fire and how to most effectively combat it. That would be tacit. The bureaucracy can only transmit rules, the explicit. Captain says, I'm so trained, he's mistaking the rule for the skill. Skill is tacit, the rule is explicit, right? A skill, a tacit understanding, is a deep, individualized habit of knowing when a fire is dangerous, and this is hard to transfer. The training is explicit. It's a rigid checklist of endangered plant zones. That's easy to transfer. So the captain had not been trained in the practice of firefighting. He'd been indoctrinated in the explicit rules of the state. He replaced his own sensory judgment, the tacit, with a bureaucratic text. He is performing competence rather than embodying competence. When we try to standardize practices like firefighting across massive bureaucracies, we inevitably destroy competence. Right? Competence relies on underdetermined judgment. You know what to do, but you can't explain exactly why. Bureaucratic practice demands you follow the rules, you check the boxes. So this I'm so trained text is a signal that the captain is operating in the performance of competence, in a simulacra of competence. He's not looking at a physical fire. He is looking at a codified mental map of regulations. He is treating the map as the territory. So this reliance on explicit rules create a thin version of expertise that quickly collapses when reality, the fire, does something that the rules do not predict.
And so that's a real problem for the U.S. has. And that horrific video that just came out a week and a half ago or 2 weeks ago or whatever, it doesn't have to be that way. It just doesn't have to be that way. We have an acceptance of we have a tolerance for amount of disorder and amount of violence in this country that I have to tell foreigners who are about to visit here that no, it's not a Hollywood image of the violence in the U.S. You really do have to be careful where you go in the U.S. And we can accept it in the U.S. We seem to be comfortable accepting it because it's so localized. When you walk through a place, if you walk 15 miles through a town, literally across the town from beltway to beltway, you can see how quickly you can be in these wonderful neighborhoods where the crime rate is almost nil. It's almost kind of, we're talking about, violent crimes that are kind of statistically in the almost never happen category. Then you walk 3 to 4 blocks and you're in places where you're talking about 50 murders per 100,000, kind of numbers that lead the world. So that disorder and that kind of crime is just so hyper localized in the U.S., which allows it to if you're not kind of, if you know where not to go, if you know where, then we seem to be willing to accept it because it's not happening to us.
The other thing about, you mentioned Greyhound, which is a great example of just the thinking of America and how we operate. I guess some private equity company bought Greyhound, and they figured out that the real estate was worth more than the actual bus operations because Greyhound owned a lot of stations.
So think about compliance at work as a pseudo practice, right? Compliance becomes a practice of its own, separate from real work, right? The real work is saving the town, saving the Pacific Palisades, but the compliance practice is avoiding any damage to the endangered plant and avoiding that kind of fine. So the captain is skilled, but his skill is in risk management for the department, not risk management for the town, right? His training is a series of inhibitions. Do not do X, do not do Y, rather than capabilities. You must do X to save Y. So this is the liberal theory of expertise versus the box checker. In a liberal democracy, we have a problem. How do we trust experts who we don't understand? So the most common solution is we force the experts to show their work, to provide the forms, the checklists, the protocols. By forcing the experts to be auditable, we turn them into box checkers, right? The captain knew that if he used the bulldozer, he would have to justify it against the endangered plant protocol. That's a hard argument to make in a hearing. He followed the rules, the town burned, but he didn't need to justify himself. The protocol created a status shield around the expert, protecting him from the consequences of his incompetence. So the captain saying, "I'm so trained," that is a statement of epistemic surrender. He has surrendered his individual tacit knowledge to the explicit collective rulebook. He let the ghost of the regulation drive the bulldozer, or rather park the bulldozer, proving that if we try to codify the tacit, we destroy the very competence that we are seeking to preserve. So what is credential inflation?
Say, well, college is really just about the piece of paper. Obviously, they were talking about the degree or diploma being the thing you're really concerned.
Right, you usually learn all the skills you need at work in the workplace. So why do we have such a ridiculously credentialed society?
About. Well, if you've heard that, they were actually referring to something that sociologists sometimes call credentialing theory or credentialism. I'm Dr. Joseph Khaw, Associate Professor of Sociology at Georgia Southwestern State University, and today I'm going to talk about credentialing theory, credentialism, and credential inflation. Now, the concept of credentialing theory originates in the work of sociologist Max Weber. He looked at how capitalism and the increasing bureaucratic nature of society led to the establishment of educational credentials as a way to sort of test the expertise of people who worked in bureaucratic and specialist capacities. Now, prior to the era of industrial capitalism and bureaucracies that Weber was looking at, the learning and assessment of skills that had to do with trades was actually done through apprenticeships, in-service training, and other types of informal methods of learning. Someone decided that they wanted to be a carpenter, and they went to study under a carpenter who apprenticed them, and they learned how to do that trade, and then they did it. But as the world became increasingly bureaucratic and structured, and societies grew larger, there became...
So why do professions have these beautiful, elaborate, and highly detailed codes of ethics, right? Why are they so altruistic? Because these are defenses against the distrust of their client, right? An occupation that monopolizes an important skill and then reserves the right to judge its success or failure to its own group, right, is highly likely to provoke considerable antipathy, right? Think about how widespread dislike of lawyers is. So when you call in a doctor or a lawyer, the client is usually helpless and distraught. You go to the dentist and you're usually reclining. So the outcome is often in doubt. And even if you have the best doctor, lawyer, or dentist, right, the client may have a problem that cannot be cured. It may not be winnable. So to protect themselves against the anger of unsatisfied clients or their surviving relatives, professions claim to adhere or do adhere to very strict standards, and they enforce them against practitioners who bring the entire group into disrepute. So I became an Alexander Technique teacher, and the part of the price of joining a professional society of Alexander Technique teachers is you may not publicly criticize other members of the profession, because that brings the profession into disrepute. Now, it wasn't doctors who came up with the Hippocratic Oath to do no harm, right? That was the public who created that. So professional codes of ethics reinforce a restrictive club and lowers competition and enables these clubs to keep their fees high. So they use stringent ethical standards, right, to improve their economic and social position and to restrict access to their ranks. So these altruistic codes of ethics by professions are strategic defenses, because professionals deal often in high stakes and highly uncertain outcomes. And it's very easy then to be blamed for an outcome that the client or the client's surviving family doesn't like. If you strictly punish bad apples via a code of ethics, the profession says it wasn't medicine that failed, it wasn't dentistry that failed, it wasn't accounting that failed, it was this specific person who failed. So that preserves the public's faith in the group. Also, professions strike a regulatory bargain with the state. They say, let us regulate ourselves, allow us to charge high fees. In exchange, we promise to put the client's interest first. So if professions ever stopped professing altruism, the state might step in and regulate them like any other business and destroy their autonomy. So the early sociologists like Emile Durkheim and Talcott Parsons believed that the professions were genuinely altruistic. They thought doctors had a code of ethics because clients were vulnerable and just couldn't judge the quality of care on their own. The increasingly popular cynical view, conflict theory, developed in the 1960s by people like Randall Collins, they argue the vulnerability of the client is exactly what professionals exploit to maintain their power. So you have many individual members of professions who are personally altruistic, but the organizations that represent them usually are acting to restrict trade and to protect the group. They want to restrict the supply to raise the prices that they can charge. And professional bodies aggressively litigate against competitors to maintain a monopoly on the official skill set. Right? And this is the standard sociological critique of professionalism. It is a reframing of ethics, not as moral goodness, but as a necessary shield that allows a privileged group to maintain a monopoly in a high-risk market. Right? You can't just accept the things that people and groups say about themselves. Now, on the other hand, engineering works so well that engineers don't have this status. Right? The greatest professional weakness of engineers is that their output is clearly discernible. Right? You know instantly if an app crashes or a plane crashes. Because the work of engineers is measurable, they are easily accountable. So if a patient dies, the doctor can say, we did everything we could, the disease was too strong. So professions have successfully convinced society that the process matters more than the outcomes. Engineers have not achieved this. They are judged exclusively on outcomes. So engineers lack the high emotional stress that grants doctors and lawyers their priestly aura. Right? Engineers intervene to make things faster, stronger, and more efficient. And this rarely triggers the deep existential anxiety that allows a profession to claim moral authority. You rarely see an engineer described as godlike in the same way a neurosurgeon might be. So engineers do productive labor, they make things. Lawyers, doctors, accountants, dentists do political labor. They manage reputations and social order. And this is why engineers are often further down in the corporate hierarchy. Right? Engineers tend to hit a salary ceiling unless they switch to management, because management is political labor. It's the ability to negotiate, to persuade, and to manipulate belief. And this tends to be more highly valued in the C-suite than the ability to build an actual product. So engineers operate in an arena that lacks mystification. Now, this is changing with artificial intelligence and big tech. Now, AI and algorithms have become so complex that they are becoming mystical. So you hear people talk about the algorithm, the same superstitious awe that they used to reserve for law and medicine. So we are now witnessing the birth of a new clerical class within engineering.
Became more institutionalized or structured ways of passing on this knowledge and assessing it. And this became what we now think of as education. And in those educational spaces, there had to be a way of sort of putting a stamp of approval that this person has learned what they need to learn to do this job. And those stamps of approval became diplomas or credentials. Now, Weber went on to talk about how the existence of these credentials created what he called a privileged stratum of credentialed individuals, meaning this sort of layer of people who had this privileged status, high status people.
So AI is changing status in all sorts of professions. Engineers currently relatively low status because their work is transparent. Either the bridge falls down or it doesn't. Now we have engineers creating a product AI that even they do not fully understand. So you'll hear top AI researchers admit, we don't know how the model learned that. We can't predict when it will hallucinate. So engineering is no longer uncontroversial. Content moderation, algorithms, data privacy, AI bias are now central political issues. Engineering is becoming more political. So engineers are finally acquiring moral impressiveness and political power. Right? This is a massive social asset for the profession, because now they operate with indeterminacy. So just as a doctor cannot guarantee a cure because the human body is complex and mysterious, the AI engineer can now say they cannot guarantee safety because the neural net is complex and mysterious. So the lack of reliability protects them. It shifts their work from productive labor with guaranteed output to a practice where they're trying to manage uncertainty. So doctors gain power from situations of high emotional stress, such as death and disease. Traditional software engineering lacked this drama, but now the new narrative around AI injects maximum emotional stress into the field, and you have tech leaders talking about existential risk and human extinction and superintelligence, so they are creating the ritual impressiveness required for a dominant high-status group. The new priests of our secular society are people like Sam Altman, who are not selling products, they're managing forces of nature, so they get to speak with moral authority rather than just technical competence. The conversation is shifting from does this code work, technical question, to will this code end humanity, which is a theological and political question. Much more status to be gained in the world of the political than the world of the technical. And we have an AI safety movement, right? A textbook example of a profession using ethics to achieve social closure, high status, right? Professions develop altruistic codes of ethics as defenses against the potential distrust of their clients. So AI safety functions similarly to the Hippocratic Oath by a profession professing extreme caution, trying to align AI with human values. These companies are protecting themselves from public anger when AI inevitably makes mistakes. So by claiming AI is dangerous, AI requires highly specific safety protocols which only they possess, they create a barrier to entry. This justifies heavy regulation that keeps smaller competitors out. It closes the status group to a small elite of high priests who can afford the compliance costs. Right? We want to be regulated. Make entering our world as difficult as possible. So the engineer who's stuck in the reliability trap, they get judged on whether or not their work functions. But the AI researcher, he deals in a black box. He manages existential dread. He performs political labor. These are the new doctors, unaccountable for failures because they're guardians of a mysterious high-stakes power. competence is a professional liability. When engineers solve problems definitively, they render themselves servants to the solution. When doctors, lawyers, accountants, dentists manage unsolvable human ambiguity, they remain masters of the situation. So most American government activity towards business consists of granting rights for private self-regulation and the appropriation of opportunities. So government grants licenses and franchises to operate a liquor store or tavern, to legal medical services, to repair services, construction, crafts, insurance, real estate, brokerages, banks, other financial institutions. And all this is framed as protecting the public interest. We need this regulatory activity, and we need a highly regulated group which allows this particular group to monopolize a particular area of business to reduce competition and engage in price fixing. Adam Smith said in his great 1776 book that seldom do men of business gather together without engaging in a conspiracy against the public. If a politician pushes this type of regulation and legislation, they get payoffs, right? They've created an area of patronage under their disposal, and they get contributions to procure these licenses. Liberal left politicians, right, really like to regulate, and that gives them more opportunities for payoffs than the free market libertarian politician. You have the licensing of radio and TV stations, airlines, drug sales, international trade. So you get all this rhetoric about the public interest and the need for regulation, which creates all these monopolies, patronage, and conspiracies against the public. Now, this book came out in 1979. Here is an ethnic breakdown of the world of business. White Protestants tend to be disproportionately in the professions and in entrepreneurial business. Catholics heavily in government and bureaucracy. Craft unions have their own ethnic stamp, set their boundaries against ethnic outsiders. Blacks are disproportionately in lower working class positions and in specialized sectors of the white-collar world, especially federal government employment. And this analysis still largely rings true today.
People whose status was at least in part based on the fact that they held this credential. That may sound familiar. It's kind of how we look at college education in this day. Also of significance is that the presence of these credentials allowed those who held it to monopolize important social positions. So the presence of these credentials as a requirement for certain fields limited the number of people who could go into that profession and allowed those who went into it to monopolize it. Only the people who had the required credential could work in that field. Now, building on the...
So school is not primarily about learning skills that are valuable at work. Right? School is primarily for acquiring the cultural stamp needed for a job. Millions of jobs that required only a high school diploma in 1979, such as executive assistants, construction managers, now require a bachelor's degree. Right? The skills for these jobs haven't changed. The barrier to entry was raised to filter the applicant pool, to create social status blocks. Now, we're seeing some cracks in this wall under Trump. We've got tech boot camps where you can learn coding in 3 months. Right? Companies are reverting to demanding computer science degrees. Right? When the market gets tight, the status group, the degree holders, tighten the rules to protect their own. So the regulator class has grown in power over the past decades. And when the liberals on the left push for more and more regulations, they are solidifying corporate and guild monopolies, which is the defining feature of the modern American administrative state that Donald Trump is trying to dismantle in favor of more opportunity for those without credentials.
The work of Weber, sociologist Randall Collins published the book The Credential Society in 1979, in which he looks at credentials and their relevance in society and helped develop this idea of credentialing theory. Now, there's a lot of different aspects of credentialing theory. Some research has looked at how employment candidates use their credentials to signal their competencies and their ability to work in a particular field, whereas employers use those credentials as a way to screen candidates. So on one side, you have job seekers signaling that they can do a particular job based on this credential, and you have employers screening out or weeding out the candidates who don't have those credentials so that they can focus their search on a smaller number of them. Now, that degree might not necessarily even mean that that person knows a whole lot about what they're going into. In fact, people who've looked at credentialing theory talk about that a vast majority of the things a person needs to know to do a job, they actually learn on the job. And that
So Jacob Savage's essay, The Lost Generation, focused on pathways into elite professional professional jobs such as writing for TV or academia or journalism. Now, this systemic exclusion or cooling of opportunity for white men has parallels in other sectors of American life. Right? So you have all these grants and prizes that are only awarded to people who aren't white or aren't men. You have all this race-restricted funding. You have all these literary prizes and awards that only go to people who aren't white or aren't male. So until the middle of 2025, the US legal system had a double standard for proving discrimination. It was known as the background circumstances rule. So the old standard was if a woman or a minority sued for discrimination, they simply had to show that they were qualified and treated worse than a peer. But if a white man sued, he had to meet a higher burden of proof. He had to provide background circumstances showing his employer was the unusual employer who discriminates against the majority. Now, this was struck down by the US Supreme Court in June of 2025. Right? They now require a neutral standard. But that this rule existed for decades highlights how the legal system formally codified anti-white discrimination, anti-male discrimination. Like any white man claiming discrimination had to provide extra proof to be taken seriously. In education and in universities, anti-white sentiment manifests as exclusionary social structuring. All sorts of groups get safe spaces and awards and affinity groups and support, but not white men. You have curriculum that is framed as anti-racist, but essentially teaches that white male identity is a pathology. So traits like objectivity, urgency, individualism are treated as examples of white supremacy culture, which teaches white students that their cultural defaults are morally wrong. We have the equity rationing in healthcare. So we saw during COVID that many of the most elite, powerful people in the health world wanted to give preferential treatment to non-whites and non-men, that white patients often needed to be sicker than a non-white patient to qualify for the same treatment. In the media, right? I don't recall any TV shows or movies or famous novels about anti-white and anti-male discrimination. Right? When a minority youth commits a crime, the narrative focuses on systemic failure, poverty, lack of opportunity. When a white man commits a similar act, the narrative shifts to toxic masculinity or white supremacy. Think about the Karen versus Chad dynamic. Right? You have a specific mockery of white behavior, white women's tears, mediocre white man. This is a socially acceptable form of racial ridicule in all sorts of elite outlets that would be considered hate speech if directed at other groups. Men historically needed to provide much more evidence that they were victims of racial discrimination than non-white men. They have to prove themselves to be sicker to get care than those who are outside their group. And their failures are attributed to their inherent nature, their inherent white toxicity. But you get very few stories published in the elite press about this kind of anti-white, anti-male hatred. Right? There's only one major Hollywood attempt to depict this. That was 1995 movie White Man's Burden, set in an alternative America where black Americans are the wealthy ruling elite and white Americans the impoverished ghetto-dwelling underclass. You had Falling Down, a movie, 1993, starring Michael Douglas as an unemployed defense engineer, has a mental breakdown while stuck in traffic, and he walks across LA. Now, he's technically the villain, but the movie is famous because many viewers sympathize with him. He represents the obsolete white male professional who played by the rules of the mid-20th century, only to find out that the 1990s economy and multicultural society have no place for him.
Credential even though it is related to that, and there are certainly some job-specific tasks that they have learned, is really much more of a signaling thing. It's much more of a status thing. So those credentials almost become sort of an abstract representation of the skills they're supposed to represent. So there's a lot more we could say about credentials and credentialing theory, but the big idea here is that sociologists, when they're looking at education through a credentialing theory lens, instead of looking at what people are learning and the
So WASP occupied the high ground of American culture until about the 1950s. So in the 1950s, with TV shows like Father Knows Best, the WASP is the standard to which everyone else should aspire. By the 1980s, the WASP is portrayed as the snob, such as in the movie Caddyshack. By the 2020s, the WASP is the target, movies like Knives Out. And you see this anti-WASP hostility most visible in Academy Award winners the last decade, who talk down and try to take down WASPs. And people respond to these incentives in a flight from white. And the core driver is status. In a culture where whiteness and waspness is associated with historical guilt, oppression, and cultural blandness, people try to exit that category to acquire the moral capital associated with a minority status. So best book on this is Ethnic Options, Choosing Identities in America. So many white Americans treat ethnicity as a costless option, right? They choose to be Irish on St. Patrick's Day to feel a sense of warmth, community, and historical suffering. They can turn it off when applying for a mortgage. WASPs often feel culturally empty. They identify often as just American or nothing because they equate WASP with boring. Or they may latch on to a trace of Italian, Irish, or native ancestry to feel interesting. Then you have the explosion of pretendians. The most significant flight from white is the large number of white people now identifying as Native American or as black. You have the Irish exit, right? People used to flee from Irish identity in America. Now people are fleeing to it. You have all these white people pretending to be black and to publish on black themes because they feel there is more prestige in that other identity.
Those skills and competencies, what we're really focusing on is what is the significance that that credential holds in society? What does that diploma, a degree, or certificate mean in job markets, in social stratification, in social settings? It's really a focus on the significance and meaning and value of the piece of paper.
So I'm curious, how might AI shift the balance of power at work? All right, I notice that most people really hate AI. I can happily talk to AI, interrogate AI for hours a day. I expect that AI will largely live up to its billing. I expect that AI will revolutionize the economy more rapidly than any other technology. So Gemini 3.0 comes out November 18. I quickly learned about it. I tried it out. It is just so far superior to every other AI chatbot. Right? It's not a chatty friend. It's a cold, hard logic machine. It is a meritocratic acid. It dissolves the appeal of vibe-based bots. Right. So if we accept the premise that AI is the ultimate thing, a system to be manipulated, tweaked, and optimized rather than a person, rather than having a consciousness to be persuaded, charmed, or empathized with, we may have a shift in workplace power. So I wonder if we will transition from an emotional quotient economy to a TQ, technical quotient economy. So there was a psychologist, Simon Baron-Cohen, who developed this systematizing, empathizing theory. So systematizers, who are statistically more commonly men, intuitively figure out how a system works by tweaking variables. If I change this input, how does the output change? Then empathizers, who are statistically more commonly women, focus on understanding the thoughts and emotions of others. How does this person feel about this decision? So for the last 20 years, corporate success has heavily favored the empathizer. Management has increasingly been about consensus building, soft skills, people skills, navigating office politics. AI doesn't care about consensus. It rewards systematizing. The person who's willing to sit there for 4 hours, obsessively tweaking a prompt 50 times to get the perfect result, will often outperform the person who tries to charm the AI or gives up after the first generic answer. So maybe we'll see a decline in the relationship economy. Many high-status jobs right now are relationship-holding roles: account managers, directors, client liaisons. Right? These fields are often female-dominated and rely on social capital. So AI may allow a competent recluse, someone with zero social skills but high AI mastery, to produce work that is so undeniable that the relationship manager becomes less necessary. So if you can generate better work in 10 minutes, you don't need to manage expectations with the client or the boss. The work speaks for itself. So the value of smoothing things over, which is often a feminine coded skill, might drop when the friction of error disappears. Think about the tinkerer phenotype, right? AI is not a plug and play tool yet. It is a plug and tweak tool. So if men are more culturally or biologically predisposed to enjoy the solitary, obsessive process of technical iteration, they may accumulate AI capital faster. So while others wait for the easy button version of AI, the tinkerers might build the custom workflows that make them 10 times more productive.
Of the credential. Now, another part of credentialing theory is the concept of credential inflation. This is sort of a devaluing of educational credentials. What happens is over time, as more and more people try to attain higher levels of education to be competitive in job fields, the minimum educational requirement for a particular job goes up. As more and more people earn a bachelor's degree to try to be competitive in jobs, more and more jobs require that you have to have a bachelor's degree as the minimum education requirement. So when that happens, what do people do? Well, people who want a leg up go get a master's degree to try to compete for those same jobs. So over time, what ends up happening sometimes is even some of those jobs have a master's degree as the minimum requirement. And what ends up happening is over time, the value of a credential goes down.
So which corporate sector layer is most at risk from AI? Probably the coordination class, the middle management, the project coordinator, the administrator. Right? There are roles that traffic in communication rather than production, and many of these roles skew female in many Western economies. So if AI agents can more efficiently and effectively schedule meetings, summarize conflicts, onboard employees, the administrative class now faces the same hollow out that the manufacturing class, which was male-dominated, faced in the 1990s. So we may be witnessing a swing of the pendulum back toward object-oriented work. So 2022 was the era of the networker. Success meant meetings, consensus, and emotional intelligence, which probably favored many feminine interaction styles. Now in 2025, we may be entering the era of the operator, where success means staring at a screen, iterating logic, and commanding a machine, which may favor masculine systematizing interaction styles. Perhaps the power will shift to whoever can tolerate the solitude of the machine long enough to master it.
What you could have done as a career 50 or 75 years ago with a high school education, you might need a bachelor's degree today. What you could have done with a bachelor's degree 50 years ago, you might need a master's degree today. So as more and more people are trying to be competitive and earn higher levels of education, there becomes sort of a flooding of the market of people with bachelor's degrees and master's degrees, and those things become devalued. The credentials inflate. Thanks for watching. Be sure to click like and subscribe.
Okay, thank you, sir.
To explain that our discussion hinges on really two separate but related concepts. And the first one is credentialism, which is the reduction of qualifications to status conferring pieces of paper.
That sounded very erudite. Statuses conferring pieces of paper. Will you all take your tassel and move it to the... Yeah.
So we may be entering the guild war, right? Credentials may not save an incompetent elite, right? We may be at a social tipping point. So if the last century, professional prestige in accounting, medicine, academia relied on informational asymmetry, right? The expert knew things the client did not know. The barriers to entry, exams, residency created a status closure that kept supply low and prices high. Now, AI may well be the meritocratic acid. It may democratize that information. It may dissolve the opaque seal of professional judgment. It may expose much of the output to direct scrutiny. Right? So this competence inversion brought about by AI may well destabilize the hierarchy and ripple through the economy. So we may have a decoupling of status from competence. So in the old world, we assume that status equals competence. If someone sits high in the hierarchy, we assume they are the best. Now, often this has been a mask. High status individuals often stop doing the actual work early in their careers. They become managers of work. They become relationship holders. They become rainmakers. And their competence freezes at the level of technology they used when they were in their 20s, right? AI tools don't care about the president's corner office. When you run work through the software, the AI will act as neutral auditor. It might empirically reveal that the emperor has no clothes.
I can dumb it down if you want.
No, I will right now. It's really
Okay.
the practice of relying on earned credentials when hiring staff or even assigning social status.
Right. It's not being able to even apply to a job if you don't have a certain certificate, even if you have the ability to perform in that role.
Yes, it's putting that formal educational credential above other ways of understanding human potential and ability. And it's really what is underlying credential creep or credential inflation.
Which is actually the second concept, the credential inflation.
So someone who's competent at AI turns out, say, better quality of work than someone who's high status. Clients will catch on. And we may have this competence inversion, right? We may have more and more credentialed high status elites who refuse to learn AI lose out to mediocre secretaries who use AI. Right? A brilliant mind using AI, but someone without credentials may well dominate a field for a time. So James Burnham wrote a 1941 book, The Managerial Revolution, where he saw that power was shifting from capitalists, the owners, to managers and the technocrats, right? Now I might be seeing power shifting from managers, right, the credentialed status holders, to operators, right, the functional tool users. So think about the changes that came about due to the printing press, right? Before the printing press, priests in Christendom held status closure over scripture. You had to trust them because you could not read the Latin Bible yourself. The printing press, the 16th century's version of AI, put the text in everybody's hands. It didn't destroy the religion, but it destroyed the priestly monopoly on truth. So AI may well produce uncredentialed Martin Luthers who point at the text, the AI report, and say, look, the interpretation given by those with high status and credentials is wrong. So the bishops, the credential class, will hate this because it threatens their role as the exclusive conduit to the truth. So in the short term, the guilds will win. We're going to have a flurry of ethics opinions and safety guidelines from professional bodies declaring that using AI without a credentialed supervisor is unethical or dangerous. They will try to criminalize the competence of the uncredentialed to protect the income of the incompetent credentialed. Right? We will see a crackdown on authorized practice of AI. But in the long term, the market is ruthless. Capital will always flow to the lowest cost of production for the highest quality output. If a centaur, right, a smart operator with AI can deliver a 95% perfect result for $100, and a pure credentialed human, member of the credentialed elite, delivers an 80% result for $1,000, the dam will break. So we may be entering the age of the competence black market. Clients might quietly bypass the guilds to get the work done better, faster, and cheaper by the people who know how to use AI tools. Credentials will hang on the wall, but the real work will increasingly move to AI.
Which is very much like regular inflation, but with credentials, right?
Yes, but gas is cheaper with it. Yes, exactly. Essentially, yes.
Yes, a lot of people full of hot air. So yeah, a lot of free gas.
So a good way to think about it actually comes from Collins himself, the author of the book that I started off with in the intro.
Mm-hmm.
And the way he frames it is he thinks of it as a credential.
And the chat says he's witnessed firsthand errors by AI. I'm unable to trust AI. Well, what about people? People make errors, right? Everybody makes errors.
Vortex,
Ooh.
Right? Which such imagery here. So
yeah.
Basically, you have a higher education system locked in this cycle of expanding access to degrees. So as more and more people can get degrees, what happens? It dilutes the value of those degrees in the employment market,
Sure.
which what happens? Oh, drives like some of those degree holders back to campus for an even more advanced degree.
Right. Yeah. And conceivably, this could go on until lunch ladies need PhDs.
You think I'm getting my PhD for nothing? I want to be slinging pizza. I want to be.
you want hey, Meatloaf Wednesdays, man. That's where it's
That's
at.
right. I'm going to put this hairnet to good use. That's exactly right.
I can see it now.
So it's also known as up credentialing, which is essentially what you're capturing when you explain it as the lunch ladies seeing PhDs, right? Because before, an undergrad degree would have been enough to get you an entry-level job, but now like an entry-level job requires a master's degree. And before we get too much into our discussion,
so I asked ChatGPT and Gemini an identical question on Friday. Give me poignant examples from the news of people encountering status closure. And virtually all the examples and backup links given to me by ChatGPT were hallucinated, while everything that Gemini gave me was factual. So one example from the news, the debanking of ideological outsiders. So throughout 2024 and 2025, the Office of the Controller of the Currency and House Committees conducted reviews into the practice of major banks terminating the accounts of clients deemed high risk. So access to the modern economy was no longer a right of citizenship, it was a privilege of status conformity. Right? Banks used vague reputational risk clauses to close the accounts of individuals or businesses associated with disfavored political views or industries, such as firearms, fossil fuels, or heterodox media. Then you had credentialist closure against nurses. So there was a proposal to exclude nursing degrees from the federal classification of professional degrees regarding student loan caps. All right, by legally defining professional to include doctors, dentists, and pharmacists, but excluding nurses, the Trump administration drew a status line that has massive financial implications. Professionals get higher lending caps, non-professionals do not. Throughout 2025, we had battles over neighborhood character. So we have all these California towns like Los Gatos and Davis intensifying using environmental lawsuits and zoning laws to block public housing, right? You have communities lifting the drawbridge to try to keep people out. Residents will cite neighborhood character or environmental concern to stop the building of new apartments. We have the good moral character trap. So there are all these barriers to work in various occupations, particularly in California, where occupational licensing boards get to use good moral character clauses to deny licenses to people with past criminal records, even for trades like barbering or plumbing. Right? This creates a permanent underclass, denied the possibility of redemption. We have an end of legacy admissions. Right? California passed AB 1780, banning legacy admissions at private universities. For decades, these elite institutions maintained a backdoor for the children of alumni. So I also gave up on ChatGPT. I asked Gemini for memoirs that illustrate the pain of status closure. So Returning to Reims by Didier Eribon, 2009. Celebrated French intellectual gay man, spent his life writing about the shame of sexual difference. He returns to his working class hometown, realizes he has built a second closet, a class closet. He illustrates how the French education system acts as a machine of status closure. And he describes the physical sensation of social vertigo, the realization that despite his fame, despite his degree, his habitus, his accent, his taste, his memories, his experience of life will always mark him as an outsider in the Parisian elite. He argues the left abandoned the working class, closed the door on them, and drove his own family toward the National Front.
Discussion. I just want to say that, it looks like we're to blame employers, right, for requiring these inflated credentials, which to some degree, pun intended,
right.
Pun not intended, which employers ought to be blamed. But I'm also like, if I can get somebody who has a master's degree versus a bachelor's degree, can we really fault them? You know what I'm saying?
Right. No, absolutely not. Right. Well, sure, we're going to, but there's right an argument to be made for if you can do it, then why not do it? But
right.
I think even your example is a little bit inflated because you're talking about an undergrad degree getting an entry-level job, but did you know in the 1970s 3 out of 4 jobs required a high school diploma or less? And in 2021, in contrast, 2 out of 3 jobs required some sort of post-secondary education.
So in our lifetime, basically, I needed to be like a middle school graduate, and now I need to have a graduate degree to hold like the same job, potentially.
Potentially, yeah. No, that's absolutely right.
Crazy. I believe it, though. I believe it. And what slays me is that when I'm reading these job postings, right? And they're asking for a degree. And I know that the skill set that job needs is not taught in that bachelor's degree program.
Sure.
Boy, that chaps me. I'm not even gonna lie. It really does. And what's crazy is that this shift that we're talking about right now is especially pronounced in positions that have historically been dominated by workers without a college degree. So like what changed, right?
Right.
You know?
Well, right. I think it's getting back to what you said. It's if I can get somebody with a degree to do this job for the same wage, essentially, why not? I mean, I think the rationale is the higher education results in a higher quality employee, which will result in a higher quality product for the company. But that's dubious at best. Right?
You say that. I wish this was almost like not just voice, because I just rolled my eyes so hard. I almost lost a contact back in my brain.
Right. Well, I mean, that's the math I think that's being done here. And we see, like, in your example, employers are asking for bachelor's degrees, not only when that bachelor's degree didn't yield the skills that job needed, but in many cases, asking for the degree made that position harder to fill. And with our aging workforce, this isn't the direction that we need to be moving in.
Right, exactly. So you think of it as like elevating it, but in my mind, the visual I get is they just drop the limbo stick just like a little lower, right? You know what I mean? Though?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So less people can get in. Right.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. So yeah. So like, not only is the employer not getting what they need in a timely fashion, but what also is happening here is that they're making a lot of those middle skill career pathways just obsolete. There's almost no way to get into certain career fields.
So many of the most compelling stories about status closure come from literature. The Great Gatsby, where Gatsby acquires money, manners, myth, but he never acquires pedigree, right? Old money tolerates him as entertainment, then discards him at the first sign of inconvenience. He dies alone. The gate was never unlocked, it only looked ajar. Madame Bovary, Emma, mistakes consumption for elevation. She borrows, she performs, she mimics. No one rescues her because she never truly belonged. When her credit collapses, so does her status. The trial. The protagonist is never told the rules. Every institution assumes his guilt. Status here is procedural, not moral. The remains of the day, where the protagonist mistakes service for status. He gives his life to a class that values him only as furniture. When history moves on, so does his use. He realizes that dignity without agency is just servitude. The gates close politely and forever. Talented Mr. Ripley. Ripley understands status, cannot enter into status honestly, so he commits murder to take on another man's life. So literature is honest about status closure in a way that modern self-help is not. Right? Modern self-help lies by omission. Literature tells the part you're not supposed to say out loud. Self-help assumes status is elastic. You just try harder, you reframe, you network better, you optimize, you visualize. Right? The implicit promise is that systems are neutral and that persistence converts cleanly into assent. Failure is just an input problem, wrong mindset, insufficient grit, bad morning routine. Literature knows this is false. Literature knows this is false. Serious novels written by people who watched the gates close and kept their eyes open. Self-help says setbacks are feedback. Literature says setbacks are verdicts. Gatsby executes the ultimate self-help arc. He reinvents himself completely. New identity, new wealth, new narrative. Still cannot cross the one line that counts: pedigree. Self-help frames status as a ladder. Literature frames status as a moat. Self-help pretends credentials are optional. Literature shows you when they are not. Self-help moralizes success. If you failed, you probably broke some inner law. Literature refuses to provide that comfort. Systems do not need to explain themselves to those they have classified. Self-help says clarity is always available. Literature says much of life is opaque, and opacity will be used as a weapon. Another lie of self-help is that authenticity is rewarded. Be yourself. Live your truth. Bring your whole self to work. Literature is brutal about this. Authenticity accelerates status closure. It accelerates erasure. Self-help sells self-expression. Literature documents social exclusion and selection. Self-help cannot tolerate irreversible loss. Right? Every chapter must end in leverage. Literature accepts finality, that often there are no second chances. Literature does not deny agency. Literature is not nihilism, it is accuracy. Literature denies fantasy. It shows that effort only matters inside the boundaries, never across the boundaries. It shows that some doors open only before you know they exist. Literature shows that timing, origin, patronage will often outweigh virtue. Dignity consists not in winning, but in simply accepting the truth. Self-help comforts the ego. Literature trains perception.
Fields these days, like executive assistants, right? I don't want to be an executive assistant straight out of my graduate program in U.S. history and world art. You know what I'm saying?
Right. No, I wouldn't want to either.
I don't.
Yeah, those middle skilled jobs have been disappearing for decades now.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that we're mainly talking about employers right now,
Mm-hmm.
but we would be remiss if we didn't talk about the part that colleges and universities play in this.
Oh, don't even get me started. Absolutely. Oh my goodness. We could have done an episode just on this.
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. So
when you realize this type of clarity, right, you'll recognize that self-help feels optimistic and thin. Great novels feel heavy and true, right? They are written for adults who have tested the world and notice that the rules change depending on who you are. Once you have experienced real status closure, you'll never read self-help the same way again. Right? I am a convert to Orthodox Judaism. My identity is porous. Right? Trads like me come across to the buffered elite as bitter clingers to guns and religion. Right? The ontological state of the self, right? How permeable we are to the world, is used as a weapon to deny or to grant status. In the high elite spheres, high status is awarded to the buffered self. The buffered self is hermetically sealed. The most important things are inside of you. You get to decide right and wrong, what is strategic, autonomous, and rational for yourself. The buffered self distinguishes strictly between what's inside of you, your mind, your meaning, your moral sense, and what's outside of you, matter and nature and society. The buffered self sees itself as rational, self-possessing, and disenchanted. Right? The elite class exercises closure by excluding anyone who appears porous and superstitious and medieval. Right? If you are swayed by tribal loyalty, religious superstition, by your raw emotions, you are viewed as low status. Right? The meritocrat and the globalist is the ultimate buffered self. They can move to Los Angeles, to London, to Sydney without friction because their identity is portable and internal and buffered. They look down on the porous working class who belong to a particular geography or tradition or tribe. Right? Weaponized porosity can become a new dominant form of status closure in institutions, confusing classical liberals. Right? It is a pseudo-porous identity. Right? It is the ideology of modern safetyism. Recognizes that the self is porous, that words are violence, that the boundary between the self and the world is permeable, and that a bad sentence can physically harm you. And you gain status by claiming vulnerability, by claiming that you're porous and demanding that institutions act as the buffer. And then you can exclude others by accusing them of penetrating that boundary. They caused you harm through their words, through trauma, through microaggressions. So the status hierarchy is flipped. The stoic, buffered, sticks and stones attitude is now toxic and privileged. High status is awarded to those who display the highest possible sensitivity to microaggressions. So trads reject the buffered isolation of liberalism in favor of a thick, porous connection to a collective, such as a tribe, a religion, a geographic group, blood and soil. Right? They practice closure against the rootless. If you are purely an individual with a thin identity, you are the enemy. So the friend-enemy distinction is a feature of the porous world. Because you are porous, because you are vulnerable, you need a tribe, a friend, to survive the threat from outsiders. The winners of life tend to be buffered. The technocrats can afford to be buffered. They have money, they have gates, and this replaces tribal protection. They can see themselves as an island. Their mind is strictly their own property. They will practice status closure by excluding those who are irrational or tribal or medieval. They will demand credentials as the barrier to entry. Right? This is Davos, man. This is the classical liberal.
Like higher education is basically like a credential cartel. It really does. Colleges have really an unprecedented monopolistic power in controlling credentials and job entry. Mm-hmm. They are really the ones holding those job opportunities in their little sweaty little paw.
So the dissident tends to have a thick, porous self, right? I am my people. We are under siege, right? They want to exclude the rootless and the traitor. They want to prioritize group loyalty above individual merit, right? This is the nationalist and the religious traditionalist. Losers in the neoliberal game of capitalism feel the cold wind of the market, right? They are porous because they recognize their vulnerability. So they may well retreat into the thick identities of nationalism or religious traditionalism as a survival mechanism against a world that is invading them. So the buffered and the porous are not just different personality types, they are different operating systems for reality. So the buffered self is the legacy operating system of the 20th century liberal elite. The porous self is the insurgent operating system, rising from both the woke left who feel harm everywhere and the dissident right who feel spiritual war everywhere. Modern workplace becomes a battlefield because it was designed for buffered people, but is increasingly populated by porous people. The old ideal is that you bring your buffered self to work, that work is a contract, you sell your labor for money, you have boundaries. If you are criticized, you process it rationally as feedback on your output, not as an attack on your soul. Right? This created the office professional, stoic, reliable, capable of working with people they despise because they can leave it at the door. Now we have the rise of the new porous worker, the liability, the activist. Work is an environment that enters them. They cannot leave it at the door because their boundaries are permeable. So this type of personality may well experience a disagreement as violence or harm. Bad words physically hurt them, and they may well demand the company act as a buffer and create safe spaces for them, turning the employer into a surrogate parent. Now the dissident might feel the corporate culture is a spiritual poison or demonic. They don't just dislike the DEI video, the sexual harassment training that they had to undergo. They feel it's corrupting to their very soul. They will check out. They may become internal exile. They may do the bare minimum while building a parallel life online. Buffered manager is in a tough place. They don't know how to handle the porous employee. The manager says, just ignore the politics and the coding and the sexual harassment videos, but the porous employee feels the vibes of the office are sickening to them. The buffered elite educated class has adopted therapy speak as its primary defense mechanism. The buffered elite hold space, they honor boundaries, they have a capacity. They use I conversation. I don't have the capacity for this conversation right now. Right? I am a closed system and you are exceeding my input limits. Right? This kills thick intimacy. The porous individual finds therapy speak evil. They crave fusion. They crave the dissolution of boundaries. They want brothers in arms. They want trad wives. They want relationships defined by total loyalty and shared fate, not negotiated contracts. So the more individualized a society, the more you have to negotiate everything and create contracts and sue over contracts. The more corporate a society, the more the important things of life are taken for granted because you're in it together. So in elite, buffered mainstream, status is given for objectivity. You gain status by proving you can detach yourself from your tribe. You can analyze facts dispassionately. You can report the truth regardless of who it helps, right? That's high buffered status. You're above the fray. The noticer, status is a word for noticing, which is an act of high porosity. To notice is to let the pattern of the world invade you, even if it's taboo. Right? The porous says, I see the enemy. I feel the decline. And they may well get rewarded for sensitivity to the vibes of civilization collapsing. Right? The buffered elite will want to exclude these people, these noticers, for being paranoid and conspiratorial. The noticer will want to exclude the elite for being blind or for being NPCs, non-player characters, people with no soul, no interior. So we're getting a sorting mechanism. The buffered retreated into gated communities, both physical and digital, where they can maintain the illusion of control and safety.
For a large percentage of our workforce. Oh,
Yeah.
yes.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Definitely.
The university definitely plays a role in controlling the rights of entrance to the job market.
Mhm.
Right. And as efforts have been made over time to make that education available to the most people, we've seen the cost skyrocket again, making higher education unattainable for some.
So the porous are forming war bands, ideological tribes. They accept that safety is impossible. The only defense is a strong offense. Right? So we have a friction between the buffered manager, the porous employee, causing a crisis in American competence that we see with Boeing and the Secret Service. Right? Look at the cascading failures of institutions like Boeing and the Secret Service and complex infrastructure. Right? Porous norms have overwritten buffered functions. Complex systems, airplane security details, power grids required a buffered operating system to function. Physics is the ultimate buffered reality. It does not care about your feelings, your identity, your intentions. It only cares about tolerance, load, and velocity. So in a high competence buffered culture, safety means physical integrity. It's objective. It's a metric. Did the bolt hold? In a porous culture, safety expands to mean psychological safety. It is a subjective metric. Did the critique of the bolt make the engineer feel marginalized? So when the organization prioritizes porous safety and emotional comfort, it becomes dangerous to offer any harsh objective feedback. So in a buffered engineering culture, a senior engineer might scream at a junior engineer for a sloppy calculation. It is unpleasant, but it maintains standards. In a porous culture, that toxicity will be punished by HR because it pierced the junior engineer's emotional boundaries. So over the past 200 years, workplaces, nation states have all become steadily more feminized and more liberal, and there's much less, say, abuse in the workplace. So there is a downside to this in some places. You get a preferential falsification. People stop pointing out flaws to avoid being labeled as abrasive or harmful. The feedback loop of truth is broken. The porous desire for harmony overrides the buffered necessity of truth. The door plug blows out because nobody wanted to be the bad guy who holded the line. Right? The human resources department is the immune system of the porous status hierarchy. Its role has shifted from administrative support to policing the boundaries of the self. So in the past, high competence, highly buffered organizations had thin membranes between workers. If you sucked, you were told you suck. Now HR inserts a thick membrane between employees to prevent emotional harm. So competence is often correlated with highly disagreeable, highly buffered personalities, right? The autistic founder archetype. And they will want to create systems that systematically weed out people who aren't competent. But now, in a different environment, people who violate porous social norms will be fired for cultural fit issues. So organizations may well purge their most competent but abrasive elements, retain the agreeable but mediocre employees, and the institution may become a warm bath of affirmation rather than a cold engine of performance. Think about the Secret Service. Identity, porosity, overrid operational buffering. Right? The mission of the Secret Service is buffered, preserve the biological life of the principal at all costs, requires the agent to be a human shield, an object. But under modern pressure, the agency adopted a porous goal, reflect the identity of the nation. They sought to increase the number of female agents and implement other DEI goals to validate the identity of the collective. So you had an introduction of these thick identity goals of representation and gender equity into a thin operational mission, and you confuse the signal. So is a successful detail the one that kept the president alive, or the one that looked like America? So by putting a higher priority on the porous goals of making agents feel included, emotionally safe, and represented, the buffered goal of physical dominance and height requirements became suffered and compromised, right? The sloped roof excuse is the ultimate porous defense. They prioritize the safety of the agents who didn't have to deal with a mildly sloped roof over the safety of the mission, right? They prioritize internal safety over external mission. And then who stays in these decaying institutions?
Did you know since 1980, the cost of a college education has risen 169%? Now, you compare that with the roughly 9% median wage increase over that same span, and it isn't hard to realize that it's out of reach for many Americans.
Or it creates this crazy conundrum where, like, in order to be an executive assistant, I have to have a master's degree. So I go get my master's degree, but then I can't afford to pay off my student loans because I'm an executive assistant.
Right, not making what an executive assistant makes, right?
Right, exactly. This is really, what Collins's whole premise was, I think, that,
So in Los Angeles, the game is reinvention, right? The winner is the person who can shed their past, their baggage, their thick identity, their rigid commitments to tribe or religion to capitalize on the next opportunity. So you win by thinning your identity, right? You get the deal, you get the role, right? And it helps to be detached. You learn that relationships are transactional. Your identity should be liquid. It should take on whatever shape will help you get the deal. The more successful you become, the thinner your identity gets. You become the ultimately buffered self. You're mobile, you're private, you're unburdened by history. When you lose in LA, you will tend not to fall back into a community. You may well feel yourself falling into a void Because LA prizes thin identity, there is no thick social safety net to catch you. The loser experiences the terrifying reality of being an atomized individual with no market value. This psychological pain, isolation without dignity, is what radicalizes people. They crave the thickness they see elsewhere because their thin freedom has revealed itself to just be loneliness. So look at the TV show Blue Lights, set in Belfast. The game is loyalty. The winner is not the one who leaves or changes. The winner is the one who stands his ground and serves the tribe. So you win in a thick culture, a tribal culture, right, by being loyal. Your success is tied to how well you embody the tribe. The more status you gain, the thicker your identity becomes.
The way he frames it, actually, the way he phrases it rather, is he says that, and this is way back when, that's what kills me, is that it's so applicable to today, but like he was talking about it like many moons ago, like 40 years ago, he was talking about that these spiral education requirements have transformed college campuses into toll booths on the road to middle-class respectability.
So the loser in Belfast can fall back on his tribe, right? The loser in LA becomes a failed unit of production. They become invisible. Now, Bondi's Jewish community represents a hybrid status that is infuriating to the radicalized loser. So Bondi Jews are simultaneously thin winners. They tend to be affluent, integrated into high-status Australian beach life. They are successful professionals. They are thick winners. They are deeply connected to an ancient tradition. They have families. They're connected to a tribe, to the Jewish state. They have strong social capital. So to a radicalized loser who feels they have neither money nor status nor tribe, this combination is the ultimate insight. Right? The Bondi Jews seem to have it all, which refutes the radicals' worldview that the modern world forces you to be a bug man to survive. Australia is probably the most buffered nation on earth. It has a geography that creates a literal buffer. It has a culture that creates a psychological one. Australia has a social contract based on fairness and mateship. These are thin virtues. They imply that if you follow the rules, you don't take yourself too seriously, right? You'll avoid tall poppy syndrome. You'll be a good mate. Everyone will be safe. So this creates a society with low vulnerability. People tend to believe that terror attacks are something that happens overseas. Now, this Bondi terror attack shocks because it violently reintroduces the reality of porosity into a buffered space, demonstrates that the Australian state, the buffer, cannot seal out the thick conflicts of the world, such as the friend-enemy distinction. So for the Australian public, this is cognitively dissonant. They want to view the event as a mental health failure, a thin malfunction, a lack of speech regulation, a lack of gun control, all thin malfunctions. They don't want to see it as an act of war, a thick invasion. They admit it's an act of war. They admit that the buffer is gone. So attacks like this force the hybrid community to choose a side and to destroy the delicate balance that they have enjoyed. Before the attack, the Bondi Jew could move fluidly between the thin world of the surf and the cafe culture and the thick world of the shore. The attack now forces a thickening of identity. The thin public space, the street, the mall, is increasingly hostile territory for Australian Jews. The community must retreat into thick spaces such as secured schools, guarded synagogues for survival. This creates a status closure loop. Right? The Jews of Bondi now have incentives to withdraw their trust from thin Australian mainstream, and they recognize the government's inability or unwillingness to protect them as a breach of contract. They are likely to become more Schmittian, to view the world strictly as friends who protect the tribe and enemies who wish to harm it. The thin identity of being an Aussie becomes secondary to the thick identity of being a Jew, because only the latter identity offers a framework for understanding why they were targeted. So the attack kills the Bondi dream, the idea that you can enjoy the safety and freedom of a thin liberal society while maintaining the soul and connection of a thick religious one. The violence forces a retreat into the tribal fortress.
Toll booths.
Yeah, I think toll booths is exactly the right metaphor to use there. I mean, they're essentially just collecting fees to allow entry into the workforce. I mean, that's what they're doing. Because really, like you said, for a lot of jobs, the degree program doesn't teach you the skills you need to do the job. And I think another reason that college education is desirable, beyond getting that access, is that it provides a perceived socioeconomic, which actually means competitive advantage. And this isn't anything new. I mean, I think that predates even Professor Collins's 40-year-old book.
So you're hinging on the perceived part there.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
I think this is going to
Right.
help me, right? I think that
Mhm.
getting this degree is going to make me a more attractive candidate. I think this certification is going to give me a leg up over the competition for this position.
Mm-hmm. Right. But as we were talking about this in preparation for this, right? We were talking about like this even comes down to like the fiber of our nation, right? This is what you were saying you had discovered in your
Right.
preparation.
Yeah. Right. Exactly. So
But think about some of the differences between California and Texas. This debate is usually framed around taxes, but that's a distraction. The real class war happens in the licensing codes. Right? California is the most aggressive status fortress in the United States. It has weaponized occupational licensing to turn productive labor, such as cutting trees, putting out fires, painting nails, pouring concrete, into political labor. You have to fill out forms, pay fees, pass exams. Right? California has all these ways of closing the gate on the working class. Right? The distance to dignity is larger in California than any other state in the nation. Right? There are more burdens to entering low-income occupations in California than anywhere else in America. It is the most #1 burdensome state for licensing. Average fees about $500 a year, about the highest. Average days lost to education, 827 days. In Wyoming, often you can just start working. They license only 26 low-income occupations. In California, you must get permission. California licenses 76 low-income occupations. In other states, a working-class man with a skill is an entrepreneur. California, until he pays the state and waits 2+ years, he is a criminal. Think about the tree trimmer and this war on productive labor. Right? Your job is to cut tree limbs. Right? In California, you cannot legally trim a tree for more than $500 without a C61 D49 tree service contractor license. You must prove 4 years of journeyman level experience. How do you get 4 years of experience if you can't legally run your own small business to get it? You must submit yourself to a larger firm, the guild, as an employee for 4 years before the state allows you to compete with them. So this destroys the guy with a truck and a chainsaw path to the middle class, forces independent men to become permanent employees of large incumbent firms. Think about the handyman exemption. That's capped at $500 total labor and materials in California. Right? You cannot do a single significant landscaping job without a C27 landscaping contractor license. So California license boards often include good moral character clauses. Right? Any kind of past criminal record, the board likely to deny your license. You are required to have 1,600 hours of training to become a cosmetologist in California, but only 110 hours for an emergency medical technician who saves lives. Right? The system is a fraud. This is not about safety. This is about rent seeking. Cosmetologists compete with existing salons, so the gate is kept high to protect prices.
let me give you a breakdown of a quick breakdown of the history of higher education credentials, right? Which is distinct from the underlying education itself. Okay, so the history of higher education credentials is the history of the elite trying to distinguish themselves, right? During the colonial era, very few students completed degrees or earned any credentials.
Right, you don't have to end all forms of state disclosure. That would be impossible. But the more visible you make the forms of state disclosure, the more honest you are, the more you will restore social cohesion, excellence, and social trust. The more you make the keys to status objective and fair, the more social trust and excellence you will get. Right? Create ways for people to build a meaningful, dignified life rather than freezing to death on the doorstep. So this is what the Trump administration is trying to do. It's trying to dismantle the credential society. Right? It's trying to make the country more user-friendly for its base, and it wants to punish the highly credentialed elite. Right? Trump wants people to be able to bypass the gatekeepers. They want to create roads around the traditional degree for entry system. Trump wants his base, who tend not to be college educated, to be able to find status and employment without needing approval from hostile elite institutions. Trump has demoted the importance of the college degree in federal hiring. His merit hiring plan forces federal agencies to put a higher priority on skills rather than educational credentials. Right? HR departments are now instructed to recruit directly from trade schools, community colleges, and homeschooling networks rather than exclusively from universities. Trump wants to break accreditation monopolies. Right? The regional monopoly of university accreditors has been broken. You have now new non-traditional accreditors entering the market, and colleges can shop around for accreditation. This is opening the door for trade schools, online academies, conservative aligned institutions to grant recognized degrees or certificates without adhering to the ideological requirements of the established academic guilds.
Then, in the years leading up to the revolution, the bachelor's degree emerged as the accepted way for the merchant elite to bestow social status on their sons. Attempting to increase the prestige of one's occupation became the standard among working class individuals trying to recover from the financial hardships of the time.
So the Trump administration wants to create more trade schools and put less importance on liberal arts degrees, right? Trump wants to focus on creating high-paying, skilled trade jobs. And Trump frames the credential class as debt-ridden and devoid of practical skills. So the first prong is about bypass roads around credentialism. Second prong is about tearing up the pavement of the old establishment. Trump is attacking the prestige and the financial viability of institutions that produce our reigning elite. One weapon is the new endowment tax, right? It's 8%, bumped up from 1.4%. Right? And he has created a dial he can turn. The infrastructure is in place. If universities don't comply with Trump's other demands, such as crushing anti-Israel campus protests or ending DEI, the threat is no longer we might tax you. It is we will raise Tier 3 from 8% to 15% next year. The 8% endowment tax is now paired with the university accountability tax. We have provisions that allow the Department of Education to strip federal student loan eligibility from schools that violate civil rights by practicing anti-white discrimination. This Trump legislation mandates that accreditors cannot require DEI statements for certification. Trump is treating universities not as sacred temples of learning, but as hedge funds with a tax exemption. Institutions that drain resources to fund their administrative bloat. Trump is purging the deep state. Right? Tens of thousands of federal policy influencing civil service jobs have been shifted to at will. The permanent bureaucracy has lost job security. The president can fire career officials who resist his agenda. He can replace them with loyalists. He can decapitate the administrative state's resistance. Trump is attacking the guilds of law and medicine. Administration is not just deregulating, it is regulating against its enemies. The Department of Education will investigate law schools and medical schools for anti-white discrimination. Medicine is the ultimate credentialed guild, right? It's a closed system where experts dictate what you can put in your body and how you are treated. Trump is breaking up the priesthood of the FDA. He's purging woke ideology from medical boards, right? Trump views the FDA as a bottleneck of the deep state, as a group of unelected bureaucrats who delay life-saving treatments and protect big pharma monopolies.
And then unqualified individuals turn to professions such as medicine and law, which at the time had very low barriers to entry.
Oh, the jokes I could make.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
So Trump has radically expanded the 2018 right to try law. So patients now have easier access to drugs that have passed the phase 1 safety trials but haven't completed the years-long efficacy trials. So Trump's message is you own your body, not the bureaucrats. If you want to take a risk on an experimental drug, you don't need a permission slip from an FDA panel. So the FDA is now directed to automatically fast-track approval for any drug or device that has already been approved by trusted peers in the UK, Japan, Australia, Israel. So this outsources the FDA's job. The FDA has been stripped of its power to be the sole arbiter of truth. The agency has been humiliated. It's been taught if it's safe enough for the Japanese, it is safe enough for us. Trump sees medical schools and licensing boards as the root cause of ideological capture in healthcare. We have Trump opening civil rights investigations into medical schools that use holistic admissions to practice anti-white discrimination. Trump will cut off NIH research grants, the lifeblood of major medical centers, if they practice anti-white discrimination. We have new rules that strengthen protections for doctors and nurses who refuse to perform transgender surgeries. Right? Religious and conservative medical professionals get to remain in the system without being purged by their hospital HR departments. Right? The administration is not just banning transsexual procedures on minors, it is turning the legal system against the doctors and institutions that perform them. Trump has clarified that gender-affirming care for minors is experimental. That means malpractice insurances won't cover it. Doctors are terrified. If they perform these surgeries on minors and the patient regrets it 10 years later, the doctor is personally liable. Right? Conducting gender transition surgeries for minors is effectively being banned through financial terror, not just criminal law. The administration is stripping the expert class of its biggest powers, the power to say no, because FDA approvals have now increasingly been bypassed, and the power to define standard of care. The priestly class is getting defunded. We have a sweeping set of orders to cut federal funding to any agency or contractor maintaining DEI departments. Trump is demonetizing the liberal arts degree. He's re-monetizing loyalty and utility. He is creating a fast lane for his voters where loyalty and competence defined by him are valued over credentials. He is turning his enemies' greatest assets, their endowments, their tenure, their accreditation control, into liabilities. He's forcing them to spend their resources defending their existence rather than expanding their influence.
I mean, I don't know if it's that applicable here, but the whole thing about people being called doctor, right? And they're like, unless you're a medical doctor. And I'm like, actually, it started off in academia. And then they bestowed doctor upon medical folk.
So the military is probably the hardest nut to crack in the war on the Credential Society. So in 2025, Trump didn't just fire people, he broke the guild. He created a warrior board. He dismantled the general class. He bypassed the Pentagon's internal HR bureaucracy, created a direct channel for Trump to remove officers for lack of leadership qualities. He has targeted those who pushed DEI, vaccine mandates, or resisted his agenda. He's taken over the Justice Department and the Civil Rights Division and turned these agencies into pursuing anti-white discrimination.
Right, to differentiate them from the guy selling his snake oil door to door.
Right.
Which, don't underestimate that. A little behind each ear, clear you right up. Anyways, yeah, good.
For a majority of our
And think about the security clearance, right? The ultimate credential of the DC elite allows them to work in the private sector in defense contracting and consulting. They get to appear on cable news as experts, right? The administration decided to demonetize this, right? They revoked the clearance of the 51 former intelligence officials who signed the 2020 letter claiming the Hunter Biden laptop was Russian disinformation. This wasn't just symbolic. Without a clearance, these former officials became radioactive to defense contractors. Their credential was revoked. Their ability to earn was destroyed. Tulsi Gabbard reduced her agency's workforce by 40%. She purged the administrative layer that was hostile to Trump. Right? If the deep state's power comes from keeping secrets, Trump's power comes from increasingly spilling them through the Epstein and JFK files. So in the old system, the expert with the clearance knows the truth and you have to listen to them. In the new system, the expert is suspect, the raw data is online, and you get to decide what is true. The Department of Justice was a central battlefield in 2025. It's the institution where the credentialed society, the lawyers, the judges, the career prosecutors, hold the most power to destroy a political opponent. So the administration didn't just reform this department, they inverted its targets. Right? The DOJ shifted from prosecuting January 6th insurrectionists to prosecuting the persecutors. The DOJ has been reoriented to make America more user-friendly for the MAGA base, and it has become weaponized against the legal elite. You had all these pardons of January 6th rioters, and then Trump went after big